Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe into one of the most quietly bizarre chapters in human history. Picture this. It's dusk in a secluded courtyard somewhere in ancient China. The air is still, thick with the scent of plum blossoms. Crickets whisper in the background, and you're wearing those two long silk robes that make walking look like underwater Tai Chi. But what really draws your eye, what completely hijacks your attention, is a rock. Not a glittering jewel or a towering cliff, but a hunched, grey, porous lump sitting quietly on a pedestal like it just won a Lifetime Achievement Award in stillness. And the crazy part? You're absolutely mesmerized. You lean in, tilting your head. Is that a face? A mountain? The leaning form of some ancient beast? Maybe it's just a rock, but it knows it's a rock. It has presence. It looks like it's been silently judging humanity since before we had fire. You, my friend, have officially entered the world of the Chinese scholar's rock, where everything is beautiful and absolutely nothing is useful. You probably won't survive this level of aesthetic minimalism. But maybe, just maybe, you'll fall in love with it too. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk farther into the garden, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot rhythmically matching your breath. The sky overhead is a chalky lilac and lanterns begin to glow, casting long, sleepy shadows over the landscape. This isn't just a backyard, it's a carefully curated dreamscape. Bamboo rustles like whispering paper, and all around are odd-shaped rocks, each one seeming a little more dramatic than the last. There's one shaped like a folding mountain, all sharp ridges and dips like the hem of an imperial robe. Another looks like it's perpetually collapsing in slow motion. One is so perfectly hollow it could be worn as a crown, though no one would dare. These aren't garden decorations, they're personalities. Some look noble, others seem broody. One looks like it's plotting revenge. And you're not just seeing things. That's exactly what they wanted. The ancient scholars, poets, painters, bureaucrats with feelings saw rocks not as debris or tools, but as companions. They believed these oddly shaped stones contained the very spirit of nature, that they held miniature universes inside their craggy frames, that by sitting with them you could understand the Tao, the way, the flow of all things. Not that they'd explain any of this to you. These weren't rock collectors the way your uncle collects beer cans. No, these were full-blown connoisseurs of silence, whisperers of granite, dreamers who stared at rocks for hours, like full daylight savings time hours, and came away claiming to feel wiser. The tradition goes way back, deep into the mists of the Han Dynasty and beyond. But it really starts picking up speed during the Tang Dynasty, China's golden age of poetry, tea, and very long sleeves, the kind of time when people had the luxury to ask, but what if the rock is the garden? The scholars believed in something called shanshui, literally mountain water. It wasn't just landscape, it was philosophy. Mountains stood for stability and endurance. Water stood for movement and change. Together they balanced each other out. A scholar's rock, in its perfect ruggedness, suggested a mountain. You didn't need the whole mountain, just the vibe. Think of it as the world's slowest, least efficient hologram. And there was a reason for this obsession. Scholars, especially those in official court positions, were often trapped. They couldn't go gallivanting through misty gorges or climb sacred peaks on a whim. Politics, responsibilities, war, and deadlines kept them in cities. So they created little portable landscapes, a piece of wilderness you could put next to your desk. Sounds kind of relatable, right? Like putting a nature YouTube video on loop while you send 300 work emails, except instead of a video, they had a 1,000-pound rock that took 3 oxen and a team of groaning servants to install. Same idea, just more poetic effort. And speaking of effort, these rocks weren't just randomly plucked from the side of the road. No way. They came from sacred places, Lake Taihu, Lingbi County, Yingde. People died transporting them, not metaphorically, like actual fatal rock-related incidents. Imagine explaining to your ancestors that your great-great-uncle perished under a stone shaped like a tired goose. Some of these rocks had names, very serious names. Immortal's Retreat, Listening Cliff, Sleeping Thunder. You don't give a name like that to something you don't fully expect to change your life. But the magic wasn't in the naming, it was in the gazing. You sit in front of your chosen stone, maybe with a teacup, maybe with a brush, and you just look. You look until your mind quiets, until the ridges begin to resemble distant hills or crashing waves or your mother-in-law's glare. You think until you stop thinking. That's the goal. And maybe that's the weirdest, sleepiest part of it all. The total, unshakable conviction that stillness itself has value. That a rock, by simply existing, doing nothing, being nothing, demanding nothing, is a kind of teacher. Historians still argue whether this love for idle rocks was a retreat from politics or a philosophical protest against productivity culture. Some say it was escapism, others call it enlightenment, but you're already drifting. There's something comforting about it, isn't there? The idea that not everything has to be useful. That beauty can exist without a purpose. That a rock can just be a rock. And maybe that's why you linger by the edge of the courtyard. Even as the moon rises, you're starting to understand. Not fully, not yet. But your brain is slowing, your shoulders are softening, and that rock, it looks really wise all of a sudden. You're still in the garden, barefoot now, because somehow that feels appropriate, and the stone before you hasn't moved a millimeter. Of course, you didn't expect it to, but a part of you was hoping it might blink, just once. You reach out and gently tap its weathered surface, half expecting it to hum back. Nothing. But then again, that's kind of the point. You glance around. A low table sits nearby, half covered in scrolls and inkstones. A ceramic pot steams gently, pouring out the scent of chrysanthemum tea. And behind it all, lining the walls of a modest wooden study, are shelves filled with more rocks, each one labelled, each one revered. You wonder if this scholar ever forgets their names or gets them confused. Like, oh no, this isn't Whispering Eagle's Elbow. This is Recumbent Tortoise of the Mist. Honest mistake. Here in the heart of the scholar's sanctuary, time doesn't matter. Days dissolve into study, tea, and rock admiration. The silence is absolute, broken only by brushstrokes or the occasional sigh from someone writing a poem that will never be read aloud. The room, it turns out, is a character of its own, a symphony of balance and intention. Every item is placed just so, not in a Marie Kondo way, but more like, does this pine cone reflect the melancholic trajectory of my life? Kind of way. The rocks? They sit center stage, not hidden in drawers or behind books, but proudly displayed like wise old guests who've seen things and have decided to just chill. Now about those rocks, they're not just randomly craggy. Each one's appearance is scrutinized like a red carpet outfit at the Met Gala. The face of the rock must be interesting, not flashy, not symmetrical. Interesting, the back should be mysterious, the base stable but not boring, and it must have a sort of poetic presence. That's right, it must feel like a metaphor. If your rock isn't silently conveying a parable about impermanence, why are you even here? In fact, some scholars gave their rocks actual titles, and not short ones. We're talking long, elegant phrases you could embroider on a silky banner. Fragment of moonlight clinging to mountain's breath kind of thing. You try making up your own. Laundry heap of existential dread sounds oddly accurate for the lump by your feet at home. Still, these names weren't just decorative. Naming the rock was like decoding it, finding the story it had kept hidden for millennia. It was a form of communication, even if the rock was notoriously bad at answering emails. Historians still argue whether these names were meant to reflect the rock's actual visual cues or simply the inner mood of the collector. In truth, probably both. After all, who's going to challenge you when you say a jagged pebble represents the eternal wait for autumn rain? Your rock, your rules. And there's something deeply comforting about this, isn't there? The idea that something inert and silent can be imbued with meaning just because you decide it matters. In a world obsessed with productivity, these scholars rock offers the ultimate rebellion. I do nothing. I change nothing, and yet I am everything. Somewhere on the shelf, a particularly wobbly stone catches your eye. It looks like a turtle doing yoga, or maybe a mountain that had one too many glasses of plum wine. Either way, it's captivating. You're not sure why, and honestly, you don't need to be. You start to notice patterns. Many of the stones are displayed on custom-carved wooden stands, each base carefully shaped to match the rock's contours. The wood is usually dark, lacquered, and subtly curved, like it's trying not to interrupt the rock's big moment. No flashy pedestals here. The goal isn't to upstage the stone, but to elevate its weird, wrinkly charm. And oh, the wrinkles, the textures. These rocks are like the faces of retired opera singers, full of drama and secrets. Some look like they've been clawed by ghosts. Others appear gently melted, like wax sculptures mid-nap. One has a hole clean through it, like nature fired a tiny cannonball just to make a point. There's a term for these features: kyun, or spirit resonance. It's not about what the rock is shaped like, but how it feels. Does it inspire awe, mystery, a delicious kind of loneliness? Great rocks stir the soul. Lesser rocks, well, they just sit there looking like paperweights with abandonment issues. You remember reading somewhere that one collector refused to keep a rock that didn't make him feel at least one moderate emotional upheaval per glance. That's commitment. And this wasn't just a personal quirk. During the Tang and Song dynasties, the rock collecting hobby had official social clout. It was a mark of refinement, of someone who could appreciate nuance and texture, of a person who could spend an entire afternoon thinking about moss without getting bored. It wasn't uncommon for scholars to show off their collections the way modern folks flex their home gyms or crypto wallets. Ah yes, this one came from the cliffs of Lingbi, founded after a storm. Took 4 servants and a mule to carry it out. Some scholars even wrote odes to their favourite rocks, full poems. You imagine standing up at a party and reciting an emotional verse about your favourite sediment. Oh, jagged wonder in you, my regrets, fine nesting space. Nobody would invite you back, and yet maybe they should, because here's the thing, you're starting to get it. That soft hum of quietude, that invitation to notice, that trust in stillness. It's the opposite of clickbait, the reverse of productivity hacks. These rocks don't make promises, they just sit and let you bring your own storm or silence to the conversation. You run your fingers across the surface of one stone and feel a tiny groove, like the trail of a long-forgotten river. Or maybe the path of a worm with great ambition. You'll never know, and that's oddly okay. Somewhere behind you, wind brushes against bamboo, and the leaves clatter like bone chimes. The light in the study dims just slightly, and you don't bother lighting a lamp. You sit, eyes half closed, facing a rock that hasn't changed since before the first emperor walked the earth. And in its wrinkled silence, you hear a whisper, "Stay." The sun has long dipped below the tiled rooftops, and moonlight now glistens on the leaves like powdered sugar. You haven't spoken in what feels like hours. Your legs are curled beneath you, your hands wrapped loosely around a lukewarm teacup you forgot to drink. But that's okay. This evening is about not doing. It's about sitting with quiet things. You glance at your favourite rock, if it's possible to have favourites, and feel a little guilty for even thinking that. The others heard you. As your eyes adjust to the shadows, the room begins to feel like a shrine, or a confessional, or the world's sleepiest museum. And it's here, between the hush and the heavy air, that you begin to wonder, how exactly did this curious obsession begin? The answer is somewhere deep in the folds of history, nestled between actual mountains and the kind imagined in dreams. Let's rewind, farther back, even before the Song dynasty scholars and Tang poets started giving their rocks nicknames like wrinkled phantom of wind's despair. Go back to when these stones weren't yet sacred, but still stared out from cliff faces waiting patiently. It began, like many things in Chinese culture, with a blend of cosmology, natural reverence, and just a little sprinkle of wild idealism. During the Han Dynasty, think 2,000 years ago, back when you could still solve most disputes by referencing a turtle shell oracle, people already held deep respect for certain geological forms, especially mountains, but not just any mountains. No, the truly sacred peaks were said to connect earth and heaven. Tall, remote, often cloaked in mist, these mountains were homes to immortals, hermits, and possibly very judgmental fox spirits. You didn't just visit a mountain, you journeyed to it. You sought wisdom, lost your sense of self, or maybe grew a beard longer than your life expectancy. But here's the twist. Not everyone could drop their court job and hike off into the clouds for enlightenment. So what did they do? They brought the mountains home. That's right, miniature versions, portable peaks. Not the same as the real thing, of course, but enough to summon the mood. These early rocks weren't purely decorative. They were seen as sacred fragments of the greater whole, like pocket-sized wisdom to tuck next to your abacus. Over time, this evolved into a conscious practice. People began looking for special rocks, not just pretty ones, but those with spiritual personality, what we might call vibe. They wanted rocks that hinted at distant places, at divine quiet, at the kind of understanding you only achieve after eating pine needles for a year and forgetting your own name. The Tang dynasty brought elegance to the game. This was when art and poetry were practically Olympic sports. A good line of verse could elevate your social status faster than a well-placed bribe. And into this world came the rise of literati, scholars who weren't just academic, but deeply artistic, emotional, and slightly obsessed with curating moods. They didn't just write poems, they lived them. So it was no surprise that these thinkers would start forming attachments to inanimate objects that looked like cloud-covered mountains or sleeping beasts. They began collecting and displaying these rocks as extensions of their inner world. And not casually either. There were guidelines, principles, aesthetic doctrines you could quote like scripture. The rocks began to appear in scroll paintings, not as background, as subjects. Some even had their own poetry collections, and that's right, books about the rocks not written by them, though if one had, it probably would have outsold the poet. Historians still argue whether this surge in stone enthusiasm was a top-down trend, started by aristocrats seeking distractions, or a bottom-up spiritual movement from reclusive monks. Either way, by the time the Song dynasty rolled in, the rock craze had fully crystallized, pun mildly intended. Song scholars took it to the next level. They codified what made a good rock. Think of it like turning Instagram filters into federal law. There were now recognized criteria: thinness, shu, openness, tu, perforations, lu, and texture, or wrinkles, zhou. A proper scholar's rock should look like it's been through something. Ideally, several existential crises and a minor landslide. Suddenly everyone wanted a rock that was porous like a dried sponge and hunched like an aging monk. Sharp angles were in. Smooth surfaces, amateur hour. Bonus points if your rock had holes big enough for moonlight to pass through. And this wasn't limited to the elite. Even middle-ranking scholars, the ones who couldn't afford a 500-pound Lingby stone, sought smaller versions. Tray landscapes they could keep near their inkstones. You might call them emotional bonsai rocks. Each one a meditation. You trace your fingers along the edge of one now. It's smaller than the others, palm-sized, light enough to hold, heavy enough to anchor your thoughts. You imagine the person who once cradled this same rock during a stormy night, staring into its curves and seeing not stone, but a distant mountain range where no one expected anything of them. You sigh. And in that sigh is centuries of shared stillness. You begin to understand how these scholars saw the world, not as something to conquer or explain, but something to feel. They didn't want to know what the rock was made of. They wanted to know what it meant. And that meant long afternoons of gazing, of thinking, of just being. You squint at your reflection in the rock's surface. It's not polished, but there's just enough shine to catch a distorted glimpse. You look like a sleepy scholar yourself now, hair loose, eyes dreamy. All you're missing is a poetic name and maybe a tragic backstory involving plum wine and a forbidden love affair with someone from the scroll copying department. But you're in good company. These rocks have seen worse. They've outlasted dynasties, survived floods, revolts, and emperors with bad impulse control. They've been buried for safekeeping and unearthed centuries later, still looking like regret carved into stone. You rest your palm gently against the flat face of one. It's cool, grounding. And in the silence, it almost feels like it's listening. Or maybe you're listening through it, to something deeper, older, softer than thought. And you realize it doesn't matter how it began. What matters is that it continues, that tonight, across centuries and continents, you're part of the same quiet tradition. You sit with a rock and you breathe. The night deepens, but the world inside your mind has just begun to open. You lean back, bones sinking into a creaky wooden bench that's probably older than your country. And your eyes float lazily toward another rock, taller this time, more defiant. It juts upward like a frozen shout, one side pierced through with an oblong hole the size of your hand. You think it resembles a windswept mountain peak, or a screaming ghost, or maybe a screaming ghost on a windswept mountain peak. Either way, it's perfect. This is where the story picks up speed, oddly enough, by slowing down. Because just as you're drifting deeper into the stillness, a movement begins. Not in the rock, of course, but in the hearts of those who gather around them. Aesthetic obsession takes root. The rocks you see have now become more than just symbols of nature or spiritual resonance. They've become art, but not in the Western sense of put it in a frame and sell tickets. These were living, breathing expressions of philosophical ideals. The scholars of the Song dynasty weren't just building gardens, they were creating miniature universes, ecosystems of thought and mood, places to feel small on purpose. You imagine one of those scholars now. His name might be Wen or Zhang, or maybe something even more poetic like Silent Pine. He wears loose robes with fraying cuffs and keeps his hair tied with a simple cord. Every morning he rises before the sun and walks the perimeter of his garden, hands behind his back, gazing at each rock like a friend who's forgotten how to speak. Some mornings he nods to them, others he bows. You follow him through his garden. But this isn't just a backyard, oh no, this is a cosmological map. Every twist of the path, every ripple in the pond, every bend in the bamboo was chosen. The rocks are placed not for symmetry, but for tension. They lean, they brood, they hover near water, or emerge from sand, each one inviting your imagination to fill in what isn't there. This, you learn, is the concept of void. What isn't filled is just as important as what is. Negative space matters. In fact, it might be the most important part of all. You could call it the original minimalist design, but instead of an Apple store, it's moss, silence, and a rock that vaguely resembles a sad camel. Historians still argue whether this intense intentionality in design was rooted in Taoist emptiness, Confucian balance, or just good old scholar boredom. Probably all three. But one thing is clear, these rocks weren't arranged randomly. Each was placed to evoke a specific emotion. Wonder, solitude, melancholy, even dread. Yes, dread. Because some rocks weren't charming or gentle. Some looked like monsters, twisted, spiky, unsettling things that loomed over pathways or stared back with empty holes like vacant eyes. And yet the scholars adored them. Not because they were beautiful, but because they were true. Nature, after all, isn't always friendly. Sometimes it's lonely, or broken, or fierce. And so you walk through the garden as Wen might have, tracing the arc of emotion from stone to stone. That jagged one by the fish pond makes your heart race. The one half buried in ivy feels like a secret. The small one near the bench feels oddly familiar, like a thought you almost had. And then you spot it. A particularly strange formation tucked in a quiet corner. It's shaped like a bent finger or a hunched monk or maybe a collapsing tower. You pause. Something about it makes you stop breathing for a second. It's imperfect, uneven, maybe even ugly. But it's sincere. It's not trying to be anything. It simply is. That's when it hits you. This wasn't just aesthetic. It was philosophy by proxy. These rocks were teachers, mirrors. The scholar's garden was a reflection of his mind. To walk it was to walk his thoughts. Every stone an idea, every shadow a hesitation, every empty space a held breath. And now you're part of that too. You sit, once more, this time beside a rock, shaped like a crashing wave or a furrowed brow. You can't decide, and that's fine. The ambiguity is part of the charm. You remember the concept of lie, the natural pattern of the universe, often invisible, always present. Scholars believed these rocks embodied lie, not by being symmetrical, but by being exactly what they were meant to be. You reach down and touch the cool surface. You imagine this very rock spent hundreds, maybe thousands, of years under water or wind, being carved without intention. It didn't audition for its role. It didn't apply for this pedestal. It simply endured. And now it's here. A rock with nothing to prove, being admired for not trying. There's comfort in that, isn't there? In a world that asks you to explain, produce, perform, here is a philosophy that says exist. Let time shape you. Let silence teach you. Let your cracks and crevices be part of your beauty. The wind shifts slightly, bamboo, leaves clatter again, like dry applause. You wonder if the rocks are pleased? Probably not. They've seen better gardens, but they're patient. And somewhere in the distant corners of your thoughts, you begin to grasp why so many scholars, poets, and emperors fell in love with this odd habit, why they spent fortunes to collect useless stones, why they wept when one was broken or stolen, why they risked exile to carry a beloved boulder across provinces, because sometimes the most useless thing is also the most necessary. You close your eyes, you sit beside a rock that does nothing, and somehow that feels like everything. Your eyes remain closed, but your senses stay awake. You hear the bamboo sighing behind you, the faint creak of an old floorboard inside the study, and the occasional drip of water echoing from the pond's edge. Somewhere nearby, a frog clears its throat with the timing of a disappointed teacher. You open your eyes slowly. The rock is still there. It hasn't moved, of course, but you somehow feel like it has. Or maybe you have. Tonight is no longer about learning facts. It's about letting go. But facts sneak in anyway, gentle and unavoidable, like the scent of jasmine in the summer air. You glance down at your notes. Yes, you brought some. Don't worry, the rocks won't judge. They've seen worse. A particular phrase stands out. The 4 essential qualities. You chuckle. It sounds like something from a martial arts movie, but in this world, it's the sacred metric by which all proper scholars' rocks are judged. And you know what? You're ready to learn. First up, thinness. Shoe, if you want the fancy term. The best rocks aren't bulky and brawny. They're elegant, delicate, spindly even. The kind that makes you wonder how it hasn't collapsed under the weight of its own drama. Picture a stone that looks like it dieted purely on moonlight and whispered regrets. This quality represents resilience, slimness without breaking, strength without showiness. You pick up a small example nearby, and it wobbles slightly in your hand as if startled to be admired. Next, openness. 2. Imagine holes, natural gaps in the rock's body. Not drilled or carved, but born of wind and time. These openings are everything. They let the rock breathe. They let your imagination crawl through. You hold one up to the moonlight and see stars blink through the space. It's like looking through a keyhole into another universe. That's the magic. The hole doesn't diminish the rock. It defines it. Then comes perforation. Lou. Similar to openness, but more intricate. Think honeycombs, lattices, cavernous little pathways inside the stone's structure. You peer into one rock that has a series of looping tunnels, like an ancient creature burrowed through it out of boredom or revenge. These perforations weren't just visual pleasures. They made the rock feel alive, like it had secret rooms inside it, places your thoughts could go when you were tired of being human. Last is wrinkling. Joe. Not wrinkles like on skin, though you're starting to notice those too, but folds, ridges, textured chaos. The surface of the rock should look like it's been through emotional trauma and came out wiser. Smooth rocks? Pretty maybe. But too easy, too polite. The ideal surface should evoke the ridges of a mountain range, or the furrowed brow of a man who's been writing sad poems in candlelight for 47 consecutive nights. Historians still argue whether these qualities were meant to reflect the natural world, the inner self, or the philosophical ideals of balance and impermanence. Most likely, it was all of the above. The rock was not just something to admire, it was something to become. You let your fingers trail across the surface of a perfect specimen. It's almost skeletal, hollowed out like something that used to be whole. But there's grace in the damage. Every hole, every scar, every indentation adds character. You think about your own scars, the ones no one sees. Maybe you've been perforated too. Not by wind and rain, but by time and loss. And yet here you are, sitting, breathing, enduring. There's something powerful about that parallel. In one corner of the courtyard, a scholar's bench still bears the imprint of frequent use. You sit there now, notebook beside you, tea finally finished, and you gaze at a cluster of rocks arranged like a miniature mountain range. You begin to understand the quiet thrill these scholars must have felt. Each rock was a conversation starter, with nature, with memory, with one's own trembling soul. And don't be fooled, there was competition. Oh yes, these weren't just chill collectors sipping tea in their pajamas, they were connoisseurs. Collectors would go to absurd lengths to acquire the most poetic stones. Some even hired scouts, yes, literal rock scouts, to journey to far-flung cliffs, riverbanks and caves in search of the one. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was status. Some scholars were known more for their rock collections than for their actual written work. You imagine one such scholar, a gentleman named Shen perhaps, mild-mannered by day, ruthless by night. He hears a rumour, a newly unearthed stone near Lake Taihu that looks like a dragon coiled around an orchid. Shen sends a servant. The servant returns empty-handed. The rock was already claimed by rival scholar Liu. The next month, Shen holds a poetry salon entirely devoted to mocking rocks that try too hard to be serpents. Subtle, but savage. The scholar's rock world was petty in the most genteel way imaginable, and yet it was also full of sincere passion. These weren't throwaway fads. These men and women, we'll get to them soon, genuinely believed these rocks held wisdom, that by contemplating them, writing about them, and carefully placing them in the garden, they could achieve a state of understanding that eluded them in life's louder moments. You glance back at your favourite rock. It hasn't moved. You smile at it because somehow it deserves that. You think about what it would score on the 4 essential qualities chart. It's thinnish, moderately open, somewhat wrinkly, and perforated in all the right places, a solid B+. You suspect it doesn't care about your grading system, but you do it anyway. The point isn't the score, it's the attention. These stones demand presence. They pull you into the now, not in the beeping, buzzing, mindfulness app kind of way, but in the way that only ancient, unmoving things can. They are silent witnesses. They ask for nothing but your gaze, and in return they offer peace. Not comfort, necessarily, but peace, which is more honest, more enduring. The kind that doesn't make you forget your problems, but makes them quieter. Like distant drums in a fog, you yawn. You're not even trying to stay awake anymore. Good. That means it's working. A breeze passes through the courtyard, carrying the smell of damp earth and old paper. You breathe it in. Your eyes blur slightly. The rock in front of you looks a little different now, softer, like it's melting into the night. You close your notebook, Tonight, you learned about the 4 essential qualities. Tomorrow, who knows, but for now, there's nothing left to do. The rock stays, and so do you. You wake before the sun, or maybe you never truly slept. It's that kind of night. The quiet kind where time forgets itself and wraps around your thoughts like a warm silk robe. The garden is still. The sky has lightened just enough to outline the jagged silhouettes of the rocks around you, like ancient guardians watching over your sleep-deprived serenity. You stretch slowly. Your joints whisper like old parchment. In front of you, the same stone sits in its usual place, unchanged and perfectly indifferent to your entire existence. You love it for that. Today your mind drifts to a peculiar turning point in the saga of useless rocks. The moment the Scholar's Rock became more than a silent garden guest and was officially named and claimed. And, yes, we've been calling them that for a while now, but there was a time when even the idea of a decorative boulder had no official name, just vibes. But eventually that changed. The term gongshi, literally scholar's stone, began to appear. It wasn't just a poetic label, it was a declaration. This rock belongs to a certain kind of person, someone introspective, someone tormented by the sound of wind in pines, someone with an extremely high tolerance for staring at inanimate objects. The name may have been formalized during the Song dynasty, but by that point the idea had already taken deep root. You picture a scholar sitting cross-legged, brush in hand, squinting at a stone for so long, he forgets to write the poem he was planning. Not out of distraction, but reverence. Why write a poem when the poem already exists, quietly eroding in your backyard? Still, humans love naming things. And once gongshi entered the lexicon, everything changed. Stones went from silent companions to collected objects. It was the beginning of the rock celebrity era. You start to understand this new wave of obsession as you walk the edge of the pond. The water reflects the sky, and the rocks jut out like islands in an ink painting. Each one has a name carved into a wooden plaque, some long, some short, all just a touch melodramatic. Fisherman's remorse. Cloud trapped in grief. Sleeping animal that might be you. Okay, that last one might be your own invention, but it fits. Naming the rock wasn't just identification, it was projection, it was confession. The rock became a canvas not for paint or ink, but for feeling. A place to place your feelings on purpose, without needing to explain them. It's like journaling, but with more erosion. Historians still argue whether the term gongshi elevated the practice or ruined it. Some say naming led to hierarchy, to commercialization, to competition. Others believe it gave the stones legitimacy, a place in the cultural canon. Either way, it was the beginning of a tradition that would ripple through art, philosophy and landscaping for centuries. You pause at a particularly proud-looking stone near the garden's entrance. Its plaque reads "The Standing Alone," and you get it. This thing looks like it divorced a mountain and never looked back. Its stance is dramatic, almost theatrical. You half expect it to start delivering a monologue about the futility of war. But you also notice something else. It has a crack. A long, slender line down one side, subtle but unmistakable. Not new, not fresh, but old, settled. The kind of flaw that's not a flaw anymore, just a fact, and suddenly you realize something nobody told you. Rocks are not perfect, not even the great ones, especially not the great ones. In fact, many of the most prized scholars' rocks have visible cracks, chips, even missing pieces. Their value doesn't come from flawlessness, it comes from personality. And nothing earns personality quite like surviving some damage. You step back and admire it again. The Standing Alone. The crack now looks like a spine or a scar. You nod at it like you're both in on the same secret. Now imagine this obsession stretching across the country. Everywhere scholars are naming their rocks, writing poems, rearranging their gardens to highlight a new arrival. Families pass down rocks like heirlooms. If you don't inherit your grandfather's tea bowl, that's fine, but if you forget to water the moss around his favorite boulder, dishonor. The scholar's rock becomes not just a hobby, but a lifestyle, an identity. There are letters, entire preserved scrolls, between friends who wrote only about rocks, descriptions, measurements, drawings, unsolicited opinions. One man wrote 17 pages about the hollow in a single stone. He compared it to the sorrow of parting, the curve of a crane's neck, and the emptiness of courtly flattery. You can almost hear his friend sighing on the other end. Nice, but mine's more hollow. Even emperors got involved. Not content to let the literati have all the fun, they began collecting on a grand scale. But we'll get to their ridiculous antics soon enough. For now, you're still walking through the scholar's version of paradise. Quiet, personal, utterly impractical. You pass another stone tucked under a pine. This one doesn't have a plaque, just a smooth surface covered in dried lichen. It looks like it's been forgotten. You crouch beside it. No fancy holes, no dramatic ridges. It's small, rounded, almost ordinary. But in its quiet presence you feel something familiar, like it's been waiting, not for admiration, but for witnessing. A humble stone that doesn't want to be named, that doesn't need to be explained. Not every gongshi needs fanfare. Some just want to exist, like you. You exhale slowly. The world spins quieter again. The sky has gone from lavender to pearl, and somewhere beyond the garden birds begin to argue about breakfast. But you're not done. The rocks aren't just objects anymore. They're chapters in a much longer story, one you've just begun to read. Each name, each crack, each perch and pedestal adds another paragraph to the book of stillness. And you, dear scholar in training, becoming fluent. You remain still as the dawn slides gently into morning, spreading light across the stone garden like soft butter over warm bread. The quiet hum of the world waking up doesn't disturb the rocks, of course not. They've greeted thousands of sunrises, they've watched entire dynasties rise and fall, while never shifting more than a grain of dust. You, however, are still working on your second hour of silence without checking your phone. Your body may be here in a wooden pavilion among scholars' stones, but your mind, your mind is tiptoeing into something deeper. And today it lands on a strange, beautiful truth. The garden is not a garden, it's a universe. To an outsider, it may just look like a courtyard with some funny rocks and high-maintenance moss, but once you learn how to see it, really see it, you realize it's a microcosm of everything. This wasn't an accident. In classical Chinese garden design, especially during the Song dynasty and later, nothing was simply placed. Every rock, every path, every patch of gravel was positioned with cosmic intent. Gardens weren't just pretty, they were philosophical playgrounds, compressed landscapes, portable mountains and rivers, tiny worlds for big thoughts. And the rocks? They were the mountains, the ancient, immortal spines of the world. They were the axis of stillness around which all else flowed. You walk slowly along one of the zigzagging paths. That's right, zigzagging, because straight lines are for armies and tax ledgers. Garden paths are crooked by design. They force you to slow down, to pause, to shift perspective. As you follow the curve of the path, a rock that was hidden suddenly reveals itself. Now it's the main character. Step again, and it fades, giving way to another. Each angle reveals a new painting, each frame, a different mood. You pause at a clearing with a single tall rock positioned beside a trickling stream. It's narrow, impossibly tall, with a hole near the top. Light shines through it like a keyhole to another realm. The water hums beneath it, soft and unhurried. This is intentional harmony. The kind of planning that makes modern interior designers cry quietly into their overpriced succulents. You reach out and brush your fingertips against the stone. It's cold, slick with dew. In its presence, the stream feels like a sigh, the moss like memory. The whole setting whispers of age, not in years, but in layers. Like the garden isn't old, it's deep. Scholars treated their gardens as a sacred canvas. They weren't just displaying rocks, they were curating experience. Every visitor, every viewer, every wandering poet was meant to have a journey, a transformation. Historians still argue whether these gardens were designed for public expression or private enlightenment. But one thing's for sure, they were never built quickly. A proper scholar could spend decades shaping their garden, moving a single stone 5 inches to the left just because one morning it felt wrong. And if you think that sounds absurd, ask yourself, have you ever rearranged your desk for vibe reasons? Or lit a candle because the room needed better mood energy? Congratulations, you might be one bamboo fountain away from designing a scholar's garden. You move along the path again and notice how the spaces between rocks matter just as much as the rocks themselves. Emptiness is part of the composition. This is a lesson lifted straight from Taoism, the usefulness of what isn't there. An empty space invites imagination. A gap between rocks becomes a valley. A hollow becomes a cave. A ripple in gravel becomes a distant river. Suddenly this courtyard isn't a few dozen feet across, it's infinite. A terrain your mind can wander for hours without touching the same thought twice. You sit down at the edge of a pebble-filled pool. Across from you stands a rock that's broad and heavy, shaped like a reclining beast. It's not flashy, but it grounds the space the way a mountain anchors a horizon. You get the sense that if you leaned on it, it would hold you, not physically, emotionally. And then you remember something you read once in a badly translated scroll. A rock is not merely to be viewed, it is to be met. That's the difference. The rocks aren't ornaments, they're not passive. They're presences. You engage with them, you converse with them, not with words, of course, but with attention, with breath, with time. And just as every rock was chosen with care, so was its placement relative to light, shadow, and even weather. Some rocks were best viewed in the rain, others in bright sunlight. Some only revealed their beauty under moonlight, as if shy in daylight. You smile, remembering the stone from last night, the one that softened under moonlight until it seemed almost alive. Maybe it was just fatigue, or maybe you're finally seeing the garden the way it was meant to be seen, not with your eyes, but with something slower. You sit a while longer, letting your mind wander. You wonder how many generations have walked this same path, sat on this same bench, wondered about this same stone. You picture a scholar in silk robes hunched over a scroll, a child tracing the outline of a rock with a finger, an old man asleep beneath the pine, and now you. Not a scholar, not a poet, not an emperor, just someone who stopped long enough to listen to what the garden had to say. The wind stirs, a pine cone drops with a small thunk. You hear water splash somewhere beyond the bend, and for a moment the world is perfectly aligned. You're not outside the universe anymore, you're in it, held together by moss, mist, and a few carefully placed useless rocks. You take a slow breath, letting the crisp morning air coat your lungs like cool ink across parchment. The light has fully arrived now, draping everything in gentle gold. It spills over the garden wall, slips between bamboo stalks and stretches its sleepy fingers across the stones. It's the kind of light that makes you feel like time's moving sideways, softly, politely, not in a rush. You haven't moved in what feels like an hour. Your legs are numb. Your tea is cold. But your mind is finally quiet enough to notice something strange and enchanting, hidden in plain sight. Some of these rocks don't just look like mountains, they look like stories. There's one stone, tall and knotted with grooves, standing like a hunched old man leaning on an invisible cane. Another has a hollow, shaped like a curled dragon, mid-dream. And then there's the spindly one on the far side of the pond, with sharp ridges that resemble the spine of some extinct bird. They seem to hum with myth. And that's no coincidence, because to the ancient Chinese scholar, rocks weren't just metaphors for the natural world. They were direct lines to the imagined world, the mystical world, the one where immortals walk through clouds and phoenixes nest in peach trees. This is where Taoist dreams come in. Taoism, with its love of mystery, transformation, and gentle weirdness, soaked into every inch of the scholar's rock tradition. For Taoists, mountains weren't just dirt and stone, they were spiritual ladders, sacred geography, portals between heaven and earth. Immortals were said to dwell on the 3 isles of the blessed, or in the misty peaks of distant, unreachable mountains? Could a stone shaped like a craggy cliff evoke that same divine space? Of course it could, and so these rocks, weathered, twisted, full of holes and personality, became microcosmic peaks. They were fantasy made physical, myth made portable. To gaze at them was to travel without moving, to dream without sleeping. You didn't need a pilgrimage when your desk had its own personal fragment of Paradise Mountain. You rise and walk slowly toward a particularly eerie rock set apart from the others. It's darker than the rest, with jagged points rising like ancient spires. Up close it feels haunted, but not in a frightening way, in a lonely way. You crouch beside it. This one doesn't have a name plaque, but someone long ago carved 2 small characters into its side, nearly erased by time. You can barely read them. They mean cloud dweller, chills. You imagine the scholar who named it. Maybe he was dreaming of Penglai, the mythical island of immortals said to float on the eastern sea. Maybe he believed that if he stared long enough, the rock would show him the way there. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were literal beliefs or poetic devices. Did the scholars truly think these rocks held divine energy, or were they simply leaning into metaphor to cope with bureaucratic despair and lifetime appointments? Truth is, no one really knows, but when you sit in front of this particular stone, Cloud Dweller, it doesn't feel like fiction. It feels like potential, like a place where something could happen, like if you just closed your eyes for a moment too long, you might open them somewhere else entirely. And that's the power of myth. It sneaks into silence. It stretches across generations not as fact, but as feeling. Even the gardens themselves were built to echo this mythic geography. You weren't supposed to see the whole layout at once. Instead, it was a journey. Turn a corner, discover a mountain. Follow a stone path, arrive at a valley, peer into a grotto and find the cave of the hermit sage. It wasn't pretend, it was invitation. You pace quietly along the garden edge, past another stone shaped like a curled leaf, its ridges catching dew like tiny basins. Someone left a sprig of plum blossom beside it, recent, maybe even this morning, a quiet offering to something unspoken. And you start to understand how deeply Taoist ideas of nature, transformation, and paradox soaked into this tradition. A rock could be both hard and soft, heavy and floating, silent and loud. It could be a mountain, a cloud, a sleeping animal, or a whisper. One stone, endless meanings. You remember the Taoist tale of Zhuangzi dreaming he was a butterfly and then wondering if he was a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. That's the kind of brain this rock game attracts. The kind of philosophy that asks, what if the universe is just a really elaborate daydream carved in stone? You settle on a smooth bench across from a cluster of stones arranged to look like a stormy cliffside. The tallest one seems to lean forward slightly like it's listening. You speak to it quietly. Do you remember the immortals? It doesn't answer. Of course it doesn't. That's not the point. But it feels like it could. You're beginning to realize that this entire obsession, this lifelong love affair with useless rocks, isn't really about rocks at all. It's about what they represent, what they hold, what they don't say. They are placeholders for longing, for the unreachable, for the forgotten dream of flight and transformation. And if you've ever stared out a window and wished to disappear into a mountain fog or wandered into the woods hoping to find something ancient and hidden, then you've already done it. You've already been here. Among the rocks, among the stories, among the immortal peaks of imagination, a dragonfly lands on your shoulder. You don't move. You are part of the landscape now. A soft, breathing presence beside stones that have seen more dreams than they can ever tell. You are the stillness. You are the cloud. The morning has settled fully into day, but you barely notice. The sunlight glows softer now, filtered through a veil of high clouds. Shadows are long, but not sharp. You sit on the edge of a low stone step, legs folded, arms resting on your knees like some accidental sage. And before you, yes, is a gathering of rocks that look like they're in mid-conversation. One leans, one reclines, one seems to smirk. You don't interrupt, because here comes the part of the story where things get absurdly serious, where admiration turns to obsession, where rocks become, get this, ranked, judged, scored like athletes or reality show contestants. You've wandered into the elite world of imperial stone collecting, and it is more dramatic than 1,000 calligraphy feuds. Welcome to the Song dynasty, where even rocks had a social ladder. By this point, roughly the 10th to 13th centuries, scholars' rocks had made their way from the modest courtyards of poets to the grand estates of officials, nobles, and, yes, emperors. What began as quiet contemplation now had a competitive edge. It wasn't enough to have a rock. You needed the best rock, the one everyone else's rocks dreamed about becoming. There were official categories, competitions, published guides, entire manuals on the aesthetic evaluation of stone. It was like the Westminster Dog Show, but every contestant was sediment. And who was at the center of this geological pageantry? The most rock-besotted emperor of them all, Emperor Huizong. Huizong didn't just love rocks, he was possessed by them. Known for his refined taste, his love of art, and his, shall we say, distracted attention to ruling, he turned imperial gardens into outdoor galleries of stone. He collected rare specimens like trophies. He personally ranked them. Some say he gave them titles longer than those of his ministers. And you know what? He wasn't alone. Courtiers followed his lead. Scholar officials vied for attention by showing off their own collections. The stone you displayed in your courtyard could determine your reputation. It was social currency, poetic clout. Imagine inviting someone over for tea, and instead of showing them your new furniture, you dramatically unveil a limestone chunk with 3 holes and a name like Whispering Dagger of Autumn Despair. Historians still argue whether this trend represented a deepening of aesthetic culture or a comical overreach of literati ego, maybe both. But what's certain is that these rocks were no longer just spiritual tools. They were status symbols, and the standards got intense. Thinness was no longer just appreciated, it was essential. A good rock had to be tall, narrow, and delicately balanced, like it might collapse under the weight of your opinions. Perforations had to be deep, mysterious, naturally formed. Artificial holes? Sacrilege. People could spot them from across a courtyard, and would judge you silently with the fury of 1,000 pine needles. Even colour mattered. Lighter shades were preferred, greys, creams, soft browns. Black rocks, too harsh. Red, too showy. The ideal rock looked like moonlight carved into sadness. You imagine being a young scholar in that era, nervously placing your new acquisition in the garden, praying your mentor wouldn't scoff. He says, peering at it. The slope lacks urgency. You cry quietly into your tea. And then there were the names. You've already seen some whimsical ones, but the Song elite took it to another level. Some rocks were named after poems, mythological creatures, or legendary peaks. Others had deeply personal titles like Heart Bent Like Willow or Crying When Touched by Wind. One rock was simply named Why. That last one probably had stories to tell, but the most coveted rocks of all? Those from Lake Taihu. Yes, this one lake near Suzhou became the rock celebrity hotspot. The stones formed there were riddled with holes, sculpted by centuries of water erosion and known for their twisted elegance. Owning a Taihu rock was like owning a little piece of aesthetic heaven, assuming you could afford the price and the oxen required to drag it back to your home. You stroll now toward a particularly commanding stone in the far corner of the garden. It's tall, pale, thin, classic Taihu. One side has a hole you could pass your whole hand through. Another side dips inward like a cupped palm. It looks fragile, but has clearly survived more than you ever will. And beside it, a plaque, weathered, fading, but still legible. Bending toward emptiness, you sit down beside it. Maybe it was once part of an imperial collection. Maybe it witnessed silent duels of status and taste. Maybe it was hauled across mountains by a sweating crew of servants cursing every poetic inch. And now it's here, sitting beside a pond, watched only by you and a few curious koi. What a journey for a rock. You brush your fingers across its side. It doesn't flinch, doesn't pose, doesn't try to impress. It just is. And somehow that's more than enough. This was always the paradox of the scholar's rock. It held meaning because it held none. It became priceless because it was useless. Its value increased not through effort, but through presence. The more still it remained, the more deeply people projected their own chaos into it. You lean back and gaze up at the sky. A few clouds drift lazily past, like pale ghosts or distant thoughts. And you begin to wonder if someone placed you in a garden, just sat you on a pedestal, silent and unbothered, what shape would you take? Would you be tall and proud, wrinkled and wise, hollowed out but enduring? You smile at the thought. The rock says nothing, as always, but somehow it understands. You're still beside the Taihu stone, bending toward emptiness. But now the koi have noticed you. A few gather near the edge of the pond, expecting crumbs, perhaps, or simply curious about the stillness radiating from your presence. Or maybe they think you're a rock now. Honestly, who could blame them? The air is warmer. The moss under your fingers is springy and faintly damp, like nature's version of memory foam. You hear the distant flap of bird wings. The scholar's garden is fully awake, and so are you, if only in the most gentle, half-dreaming sense. And then you remember a story, one that feels almost too ridiculous to be true, but of course it is, because nothing in this world of idle stones and serene landscaping could top the emperor's pebble. Well, not a pebble, exactly. More like a 10-ton chunk of cosmic aesthetic yearning, dragged hundreds of miles across rivers, fields, and villages, all to fulfill one man's very specific garden vibes. It's real, it happened. And his name, Emperor Huizong again. That art-loving, brushstroke-obsessed ruler who prioritized poetry over politics and still somehow became one of the most fascinating figures in Chinese history. We've met him before, ranking rocks and sipping tea like a minimalist deity. But now let's talk about the moment when he truly lost his beautifully calligraphed mind. It starts with a rock. Specifically, a massive limestone boulder discovered near Lake Taihu, famed for its otherworldly, sponge-like texture. The moment Huizong hears about it, he becomes fixated. He must have it. Not a replica, not a drawing. The real thing, for his imperial garden, for his personal joy, for the subtle feeling it gives him that no court official ever could. So he orders it transported. Simple enough, if the thing weren't roughly the size of a small shed and shaped like the nightmares of an over-caffeinated sculptor. Still, Huizong is emperor. When he wants a rock gets moved. A team is assembled, workers, boats, oxen, architects. Normal rock relocation logistics. The journey begins. They float it down canals, cradle it with ropes, guide it over bridges, drag it through villages where peasants stare in confusion. Wait, this is what the emperor's worried about? Not the grain tax? Yes, that's correct. The emperor is worried about a rock. And then disaster strikes. At some point, likely during an overly ambitious river crossing, the rock falls into the water. Sinks, it's too heavy, too oddly shaped, too much. For a while there's panic. Accusations. You imagine an imperial report filled with the phrase misjudged buoyancy. Now here's where it could have ended. Most people, even most emperors, would call it a loss. But Huizong? Not a quitter. He orders a full-scale recovery operation. Divers, pulleys, scaffolding, reinforcements. They spend weeks retrieving the stone. This is no longer about aesthetics. It's a personal mission. The stone must reach the garden, and eventually it does. They haul it into the capital, drag it through the gates, set it on its pedestal in the palace garden, and the emperor just stares. He gazes at it, probably for hours. No advisors, no interruptions, just the most expensive nap rock in history, basking in imperial satisfaction. Historians still argue whether this was an act of divine devotion or the textbook definition of elite delusion. Some call it madness, others call it a masterpiece of personal expression. Either way, it's a mood, and it wasn't just Huizong. Other emperors had similar obsessions. One had a stone so beloved it was given ceremonial baths. Another had his favorite rock moved from palace to palace, accompanied by guards, as though it were a diplomat. You sit now looking at your own humble stone, not 10 tons, not palace-approved, not famous in any historical record, but still meaningful. You run a hand over its curve. It's rough, a little pitted, with a single stripe of darker mineral running through it like a scar. It didn't get dragged across provinces or lifted by armies, but it's here, in your little patch of stillness. And maybe, in its own way, it travelled just as far, because isn't that the truth of all this? We don't need a 10-ton stone or imperial resources to find meaning. Sometimes it's the quiet rock in the corner, the one no one else noticed, the one that whispers instead of declares. You stretch your legs, walking slowly past the larger stones now, and you notice something even stranger. These rocks, they remember. Not facts, not names or dates, but moods. They absorb silence, hold it. Offer it back to anyone willing to sit down and forget the world for a while. You think about Ali and all the people who must have passed through this garden. All the quiet conversations held with no words. All the dreams shaped by the outline of a stone at dusk. There's one rock tucked under a pine tree, half covered in moss. You hadn't seen it before. It's small, inconspicuous. But the way the moss hugs its form, it's like the earth itself is trying to hold it close. You kneel, brushing a few needles away. There's no plaque, no name. So, you give it one. Soft weight of memory. You say it out loud, barely a whisper. The rock doesn't reply, of course not. But somehow you know it heard. The garden air is heavy now, not with heat, but with that soft weight of mid-morning calm. The kind of calm that settles over your skin like silk, warmed by the sun. You move more slowly, like everything is slightly underwater. Every step, every breath is deliberate. Even the insects seem to hum more politely here. You sit beneath the pine tree again, still watching soft weight of memory, the name you whispered into existence just moments ago. No plaque needed, that one's just between you and the stone. But now your attention drifts elsewhere, to a less poetic, more peculiar part of the story. Because what do people do when they become obsessed with something? They write about it. And in the world of Chinese scholars' rocks, that meant catalogues, yes. Entire books, hand-painted scrolls, illustrated compendiums of rocks, not plants, not animals, rocks. Some were as thick as a modern-day phone book, back when those were still a thing, and meticulously organized. You imagine the scene, a scholar in a narrow room, inkstone ready, brush in hand, describing a hunk of stone like he's composing a love letter. Pages and pages of lovingly detailed commentary, diagrams and personal reflections. Some even included rubbed ink impressions of the rock's surface, like prehistoric photocopies. And the names, oh the names, we're talking full-on drama. You thought Cloud Dweller was something? Try Cracked Voice of Winter Rain or Leaning Old Man Hears the Sea. These weren't just rocks. They were characters in a novel that never needed to be written because the stones were already telling the story. One collector from the Ming dynasty supposedly catalogued over 300 rocks in his lifetime, each with its own title, description, and backstory. One had a notch near the top that reminded him of a friend's missing tooth. Another had a spiral that made him cry for reasons he never explained. Historians still argue whether these catalogues were meant for posterity or pure indulgence. Some say they were scholarly records, attempts to standardize taste, to define beauty. Others believe they were deeply personal, never meant to be shared. Emotional diaries dressed up as aesthetic documents. You, meanwhile, are wondering how long it'll take before you start doing the same thing. A rock journal. A quiet inventory of still things that made you feel something for no practical reason at all. Honestly, could be worse. You walk further into the shaded part of the garden where the stones seem older, worn down, half sunk, some nearly swallowed by vines. These are the forgotten ones, the ones that didn't make it into the catalogues. You stop before one that's cracked down the middle, split cleanly as if by lightning or heartbreak. It has no plaque, no pedestal, no name. So naturally you give it one. Divided before spring. You speak it gently. There's power in naming, not dominance, just presence, a kind of witnessing. You aren't changing the rock. You're recognizing it. And maybe, in that act, recognizing something in yourself, too. Because that's the quiet truth of these catalogues. They weren't just about the rocks, they were about the person who saw them, the person who looked at a hole in a stone and thought of loneliness, or saw a ridge and remembered their father's stern brow, or noticed a groove and felt the ache of a story they never finished writing. The catalogue became a mirror. You remember a passage from one scroll that read, "This rock reminds me of the long road home from exile. It has no beauty except what the wind has given it." That's not a rock description, that's a confession. You wonder what your own catalogue would say. Which memories would sneak into your labels? Which regrets would be buried between brushstrokes? Which rock would you write about 5 times, each entry trying to get closer to a truth you still can't name? And what would be the title of your favourite? Maybe it's one of these: The Waiting Shape of Silence, Shadow, Cast by Nothing Once, Was Fire Heard but Not Believed Stone, That Forgot Itself. You sit now on a smooth, flat stone, notebook open, pen resting on your knee, not writing, just thinking. Birdsong filters in through the trees. A single petal drops from a magnolia, landing in a shallow pool beside a stone that looks like it's sighing. You want to name that one too, but you stop yourself. Some names are meant to be discovered slowly, or not at all. You close your notebook, not a word written. That's okay. There's time. This is what the catalogues never quite said. You don't have to capture every stone. Some are meant to be seen once. Some are meant to be remembered only by the part of your brain that records dreams and strange feelings from songs you haven't heard since childhood. And some are just there. For now, for no reason. And that, somehow, is enough. You stretch out on a stone bench, warmed by the morning sun, eyes half-lidded, breath slow. The garden has gone quiet again, so quiet you swear you can hear moss growing. The rocks surround you like old friends who don't talk much, but always show up. And now that you've seen their names, read their catalogues and whispered your own, you begin to notice a strange behaviour forming within yourself. You're watching them, waiting. Not expecting anything exactly, but holding space, like something might happen. Congratulations! You've entered the most mystifying phase of rock appreciation, the art of not looking for anything and somehow finding everything. In the annals of scholar eccentricity, there are many recorded tales of men and women too, though they got far less credit, sitting in front of their rocks for hours, days, even weeks. Doing what? Nothing, just staring. They weren't waiting for the rock to move. That would have been silly. No, they were waiting for themselves to move inside, subtly, like a tremor in a still pond. And when it happened, when something finally shifted behind the eyes or beneath the ribs, they'd nod softly and get up. Mission complete. This was called stone gazing, and to modern ears it might sound like performance art or deep burnout. But for the ancient scholar, it was a legitimate form of philosophical practice, a kind of internal excavation, meditation without the rules, therapy without the couch, and yes, occasionally, a tiny bit of quiet madness. You picture one such scholar now, hair half unbound, robes slightly wrinkled, ink stains on his sleeve. He's been staring at the same rock since breakfast. The teacup beside him has gone cold. A scroll has rolled itself back up in resignation. His servant has checked twice to make sure he's breathing. And yet, he is radiant. His face glows with the kind of understanding that only comes from watching a piece of weathered limestone do absolutely nothing all morning. You laugh softly at the image, but then glance at the rock beside you. Please, you kind of get it. Because something does happen if you sit long enough, breathe slow enough, look without grabbing. The rock begins to reflect back things you weren't ready to admit. You see your own loneliness in the quiet gaps, your hopes in the sloping ridge. That disappointment from 3 years ago, the one you shoved into a drawer labelled "Not Now." It's curled in a crevice near the bottom, shaped like a sleeping fox. The rock doesn't explain, it just mirrors and never judges. That's part of its power. Historians still argue whether this practice was more about spiritual enlightenment or emotional release. Some believe it was inspired by Zen Buddhist traditions, where attention is a tool, not a trap. Others argue it was a form of aesthetic immersion, training the eye to see not just surface, but essence. Either way, it required an unusual skill, the willingness to be bored. And boredom, it turns out, is a gateway. You stay still for a full 10 minutes now, eyes fixed on a rock with a surface like folded paper and a single dark hollow near the top. You begin to imagine the hollow as an eye, one that watches everything but says nothing. You wonder if it's seen 100 people come and go. You wonder if you're the first person today to really see it. You name it, quietly, in your head. The witness. No plaque needed. You lie back and stare at the clouds for a while. Time dissolves. The stone remains. And somehow that's comforting. Because in a world where everything is always changing, always demanding your attention, the rock does none of that. It simply is. And slowly that becomes an invitation. Not to do, not to fix, not to explain, just to be beside it. You think about modern mindfulness apps and productivity hacks, how people now pay for subscriptions that remind them to breathe. And here, in this silent courtyard, a rock has done the same for you, free of charge. No download required. Maybe that's why the scholars loved them so much, because the rocks didn't offer answers. They offered room. Room to think, room to stop thinking, room to be ridiculous and profound in the same breath. One scroll tells of a scholar who sat so long with a particular stone that he claimed it began to speak to him, not in words, but in weather. He said the wind around it changed when his heart did, that when he felt sorrow, it rained. You don't know if you belie. Believe that. But you wouldn't bet against it. You rise slowly, joints creaking. You bow slightly, not out of superstition but respect. The rock remains exactly as it was when you arrived, and yet it's completely changed because you have. You walk to the next stone, passing under a low arch carved with vines and soft characters. Another rock waits beyond, twisted like driftwood, frozen in time. You stop, sit, wait, and once again you do the impossible. You look for nothing and find everything. You've been quiet for so long now that even your thoughts have started whispering. There's a rhythm to your breath that matches the sway of the pine needles above. You sit cross-legged before yet another stone, this one small, subtle, a humble wave among mountains, and wonder how many stories could possibly be left in such a motionless thing. Turns out, quite a few. Because as you continue deeper into the soft, spiraling rabbit hole of Chinese scholars' rocks, you stumble upon one of their most poignant little cousins, the miniature landscape, not the bonsai version, not a terrarium with plastic dinosaurs. We're talking about tray landscapes, portable worlds that fit on a table, a windowsill, and even a lap. Entire mountains and rivers and valleys shrunk down to the size of a dinner plate, often arranged in shallow ceramic trays filled with sand, pebbles, or water. A stone here, a pine twig there, and suddenly, boom! You're staring into an entire universe of solitude. You blink and realize these were the original escapist fantasies. For scholars who couldn't trek to distant sacred mountains because of age, money, weather, or being very emotionally attached to their furniture, these little landscapes offered a portal. They were scenes of imagination, devotion, and deep, deliberate sadness. That's right, sadness. Because here's the odd truth about these gardens in a tray. They weren't designed to cheer you up. They were designed to let you sink to help you feel things more clearly, to touch your own melancholy rather than avoid it. You trace the edge of a tray sitting nearby, shallow and oval, filled with smooth black sand and 3 small stones arranged like a mountain ridge. A single sprig of moss curls up one side like a question. This one's not labelled, you decide it shouldn't be, because tray landscapes weren't just about beauty, they were about intimacy. A full garden was something you entered. A tray landscape? Something you held, literally, in your hands, in your lap, in your breath. And you weren't just observing it, you were tending it, rearranging it as your heart shifted, adding a pebble after a storm in your life, removing a twig when someone left, raking the sand to reflect your own confusion. It was personal. Historians still argue whether these mini-worlds originated from Buddhist altar stones, Taoist symbols of immortality, or just one very lonely scholar with excellent fine motor skills. No one's quite sure. What is sure is that by the Song and Yuan dynasties, tray landscapes had become a quiet craze. Not loud, not flashy, just present. They appeared in painting scrolls, in diary entries, in letters exchanged between friends. "I've arranged my little river scene again," one man wrote, "to reflect the hopelessness of our bureaucracy. We all cope in different ways. You shift slightly on your bench and glance around. A shelf nearby displays several tray landscapes, each one different. Some are crowded with stones suggesting chaos or complexity. Others are sparse. One has only a single rock and a smear of sand, as if the maker woke up that morning feeling hollow and said, "Yeah, that's enough for today." You stop in front of one that feels familiar. 3 stones, 2 small, 1 large, no moss, no sand, just polished wood and the quiet confidence of placement. The big stone leans slightly forward as if about to speak. The others look up at it like children. You stare at it for a long time. It feels like a memory, but not one you can name. That's the strange beauty of these trays. They don't trigger specific thoughts. They draw up moods, emotional weather, feelings that don't always have words but still press gently against the inside of your ribs. You sit down, placing your hands on your knees, breathing through your nose, and you begin to feel it. Not grief, not joy, something softer, like nostalgia with nowhere to go. There's an old term for this, yujing, wandering in the scene. It means letting your spirit roam inside the imagined landscape. No map, no purpose, just wandering, like a ghost in your own memories. The rocks become cliffs, the tray becomes sky, and your thoughts dissolve into distant mist. And here's the best part, you don't have to fix anything. You're not solving, you're not achieving, you're simply being inside the feeling, like holding a sadness just to see how heavy it really is, and realizing it's lighter than you thought once you stop fighting it. One record tells of a scholar who refused to speak to anyone for a week after rearranging his tray landscape. Not out of rudeness, but because he was lost in the miniature weather of his mind. You read that and nod same. Tray landscapes were also deeply private. Unlike the big rock gardens, these weren't for show. They were hidden on shelves in studies behind curtains. Secret portals for the overthinkers. A space to mourn an old love, or reflect on a changing season, or just recover from a dinner party where someone said your poetry lacked spark. Sometimes scholars would even send trays as gifts, silent, personal messages wrapped in wood and stone. No note. Just the arrangement itself. A cryptic way of saying, "I'm thinking of you," or "Please forgive me," or "This is how I felt when you stopped writing." You run your fingers along the edge of one shallow tray. The sand is smooth, untouched for days. You want to change it, but don't. You don't know enough yet. You haven't earned the rearrangement. Instead, you close your eyes and imagine wandering inside it, climbing the ridge, stepping into the wind, watching the sky darken over your imaginary mountain. When you open your eyes, you smile. That was enough. That was everything. The shadows stretch longer across the garden now, reaching like fingers over stone and sand. Afternoon hums quietly in your ears. Cicadas, Distant chimes, the whisper of wind through leaves, the tray landscapes behind you seem to sigh in unison, content with their silence. And you? You're sitting cross-legged in front of a rock again. Of course you are, but this one is different. This one sings, well, not literally. Don't worry, you haven't completely lost it, but as you tap your fingers gently against its surface, a hollow, bell-like tone rings out. A note, crisp, low, and resonant. You pause, tap again. Another note, different, but somehow still part of the same quiet chord. You've just encountered one of the stranger, sleepier corners of the scholar's stone world. The sound test. Yes, you read that right. Ancient Chinese scholars didn't just admire their rocks with their eyes, they also listened to them, because some stones, especially those from places like Yingde and Lingbi, were famous for their musical quality. When struck gently, they would produce clear tones, some high, some low, some sharp like wind chimes, others deep like temple bells. And the scholars? Oh, they were obsessed. They'd hold little tests, tap each stone delicately with a bamboo stick or a piece of polished wood, listening with their heads tilted, eyes closed. One scholar even described the act as hearing the soul of the mountain whisper through the echo of its wound. Bit dramatic? Sure. But you get it now. You try tapping again. Dung. Soft, warm, like the sound of a ceramic bowl being filled with dusk. You feel it in your chest more than your ears. It's not just a tone, it's a presence, and that too was part of the evaluation. Sound wasn't just aesthetic, it was spiritual. The more resonant the tone, the more the rock was believed to be in harmony with natural forces. Water, wind, time, pressure, all singing back at you through stone. Historians still argue whether this belief in musical resonance came from Taoist cosmology or good old-fashioned scientific curiosity. Some scholars treated it seriously, measuring tones, comparing timbres. Others saw it more like tea leaves, a poetic superstition dressed in beautiful ritual. Either way, a singing rock meant something. It meant you had found more than just a beautiful shape. You had found a voice. You think now of the quiet evenings in some dimly lit study, a scholar with ink-stained fingers tapping his favourite stone and writing verses based on the tone. This one speaks in low fog, he might write. Or today the sound feels like goodbye. Because that's what the sound test really was, a mood detector. You try a few more stones in the nearby alcove. Most are silent. One thuds like a bag of rice. Another gives a faint brittle chirp, disappointed maybe, that you even tried. And then one more. A long narrow stone perched on a polished stand half in shadow. You tap its side. Dang! Your whole spine shivers, not because it's loud, but because it lingers like the bell of an ancient clock that forgot it was counting time. You sit with it. You let the tone fade completely before moving. That's the rule. You whisper, "Stone of hollow evening," and then leave it alone. There's something lovely about the idea that the rocks had to agree to be heard, that they didn't just sit there waiting to be admired, that they required permission, intention, the right touch. It wasn't about banging them with hammers, it was about asking. And if they responded? It meant they trusted you. Or maybe it meant nothing at all, and the scholars were simply listening for their own thoughts echoed back at them through stone. Either way, the result was the same. A moment of stillness broken by a tone, then stitched back together by silence. You walk slowly now toward another part of the garden. The older section, less manicured. The rocks here are darker, more worn, some half buried in the soil like they're trying to return to sleep. One of them is almost flat, with a long crack running through its center. You sit beside it. You tap it gently. Nothing. You try again. Still nothing, and somehow, that's okay. Not all rocks are meant to sing. Some are meant to hold the silence. You rest your hand on its cool surface and exhale. The scholar who placed this one here may have known it would never echo, that it was too dense, too tired, too old. And yet they gave it a space. They made room for its stillness, its refusal. And that too was beautiful. You close your eyes. You imagine a scholar centuries ago doing the same, hearing nothing and smiling anyway, because the sound wasn't the goal, the attention was, the presence was, the listening, even when there was no reply. You lean back on your elbows. Overhead, a bird flutters across the sky with a shriek that startles the air. Somewhere far off, a bell chimes once from a temple you'll never visit. And beside you, the silent stone says nothing at all, exactly as it should. The wind picks up, just a little. Not enough to rustle the trees, but enough to move the air around your skin, like the garden has decided to breathe. You're still leaning against the silent stone, your eyes tracing the fracture that runs down its middle like an old scar. Nothing fancy, no plaque, no voice. And yet somehow it feels like one of the most honest stones you've met. But honesty has layers. And as you rise and stretch your legs, you begin to think about something strange that's been tiptoeing around the edges of this whole experience. Something not written in the scrolls, or whispered in the footnotes. Something a little embarrassing, a little inconvenient, and very, very human. Not all the rocks were real. Yep, you heard that right. As the obsession with scholars' rocks grew, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, so did the demand. And where there is demand, there are fakes. You walk now into a shaded corridor of the garden, a quieter place, lined with less grand, less showy rocks. Some still rest on wooden stands, but others sit directly on the ground, no names, no ceremony. You begin to wonder how many of these have stories and how many are just really well-aged frauds, because, believe it or not, rock forgeries became a legitimate industry. There were workshops, techniques, entire fake rock economies, people who specialized in creating stones that looked just weathered enough, just oddly shaped enough, just mystical enough to pass as natural wonders. Some of them even added their own fake wormholes using vinegar, fire, or, no joke, cattle urine. You touch a small stone near a bench. It's too smooth, too perfect in its imperfection. Suspicious. Some fakes were carved, not with modern tools of course, but painstakingly chiseled to mimic water erosion. Others were real rocks that had been enhanced. A hole widened here, a ridge softened there, a subtle alteration to give it just the right poetic melancholy. And people fell for them, not just amateurs, serious scholars, imperial collectors. There's even a famous case from the Qing dynasty in which a prized ancient Lake Taihu rock turned out to be a cleverly disguised hunk of limestone from a quarry 2 provinces over. One man built an entire garden around a forgery. He gave it a name, a backstory, and wrote 6 poems about it before someone quietly suggested he might want to reconsider. But here's the twist. When he found out, he didn't destroy the rock. He kept it, renamed it Mistaken Elegance, and added a 7th poem even sadder than the others. That right there is the essence of this tradition. Because even when the rocks were faked, deliberately, cynically faked, the emotions they stirred could still be real. The silence could still be real. The attention could still be real. Historians still argue whether fake rocks undermined the aesthetic ideals of the literati or added a meta layer of philosophical irony. But most agree, once a rock made someone feel, it became real enough. You sit down on the bench beside the suspiciously smooth stone and try not to judge it. Maybe it is fake. Maybe it's been tricking people for centuries. Maybe it has no origin story, no myth, no spiritual resonance whatsoever. But maybe that doesn't matter because you're looking at it, breathing beside it, feeling something, curiosity, confusion, the faint buzz of existential doubt. That's real. You recall a scholar's note from the 17th century. Better an honest fraud than a silent truth, for what is a rock if not a mirror? You glance around at the other stones. How many have secrets? How many were born from riverbeds? And how many from the quiet desperation of a craftsman trying to survive another harsh winter? And does it even matter anymore? You reach into your pocket and pull out a pebble you picked up days ago before all this. It's smooth, grey, and completely ordinary. Found it near a parking lot, actually. Zero cosmic backstory. You hold it in your palm, turn it slowly, study its tiny ridges, its unimpressive weight, its silence, and for the first time, you name it. False start. You place it gently at the edge of the bench. It's not beautiful, it's not rare. It doesn't even hum when you tap it. But it's part of the story now. You sit with it a little longer. Let it earn its silence. Let it be. Because maybe the real test of a scholar's rock isn't whether it's authentic. Maybe the real test is whether you'll show up anyway. Will you sit beside it? Will you project meaning onto it? Will you let it reflect your confusion back at you gently without trying to fix anything? If so, then it's already doing its job. Fake or not, you rise. Stretch. Take one last look at mistaken elegance, or whatever your fake little friend wants to be called today. And then you move on, because the garden's still full of stones. And some of them, real or otherwise, are still waiting to meet you. The gravel crunches softly under your steps as you wander further from the bench where you left false start. Your humble little pebble with an accidental resume. There's something liberating about naming a rock, even if it was probably kicked by a dozen sneakers last week. Something playful. And oddly sincere. You glance back once, half expecting it to glow or whisper, or maybe scoot half an inch closer, Toy Story style. Nothing, of course. But the space it fills feels a little warmer now. That's the weird, wonderful thing about this whole journey. You didn't expect to care. It started with some oddly shaped stones in a courtyard. And now you're thinking about permanence, identity, legacy. Because let's face it, if people can argue over the authenticity of a rock for 400 years, it means we're all just trying to find something that lasts. And this brings you to one of the strangest chapters in the history of scholars' stones, the bureaucracy. Yes, you heard right. At one point in Imperial China, the rock obsession became so widespread, so official, so tied into the social status of the literati that it required paperwork. You sit down on a flat rock near a stone bridge, shaded by a gnarled maple. The wind slips through its leaves like gossip. You imagine a harried official during the Qing dynasty, brush poised, inking out shipping orders for a boulder, because, oh yes, the moving of rocks wasn't just a backyard errand. It became a full-fledged operation. Some larger stones required government authorization. Why? Because the manpower needed, workers, oxen, boats, bribes, maybe a temple blessing just in case, was expensive, time-consuming, politically risky. One wrong move and a massive rock could block a canal or destroy a bridge. So the empire said, let's keep an eye on that. There were permits for quarrying, permits for transport, and, my personal favorite, permits for pedestal construction. Imagine the imperial tax official frowning at your application. You want a platform that holds 1,200 pounds of existential despair. Sounds like a level 4 form. Historians still argue whether this level of control was driven by public safety or pure aesthetic jealousy at court. Some believe it was a way to prevent lower-ranking officials from flexing too hard in their gardens. Others say it was about protecting sacred quarries, places like Lingbi and Taihu, where the best stones were born. Either way, the red tape was real. You picture a small scholar in a provincial town obsessed with a stone he saw once during a misty river journey. He writes a request, waits weeks, gets denied, appeals, waits more, bribes someone, finally gets approval, only to have the stone fall apart during transport because a junior worker thought that hole didn't matter. Back to the application table. You chuckle, and yet, despite the absurdity of the bureaucracy, there's something kind of touching about it, all that effort, all that planning, all that formal, rigid machinery of government for a rock. Not for treasure, not for defense, not even for agriculture, just to place a weirdly shaped lump of calcium carbonate near your teacup so you could gaze into its weathered face and feel like maybe, just maybe, you weren't completely alone in the universe. That's commitment. You rise and follow a stepping stone path that leads into a more secluded part of the garden, one partially hidden by tall grasses and crooked willows. The stones here are smaller, not famous, not flashy, Maybe they never had permits. Maybe they were snuck in. Quiet rocks that didn't ask for attention. They simply settled.
Lead. You kneel beside one. It's curled like a sleeping animal. No holes, no sound. Just smooth, ancient presence. If this rock were a person, it'd be the grandparent who says almost nothing but never forgets your birthday. You whisper to it, unregistered wisdom, and the garden seems to smile. You sit with it a while, tracing the roughness on one side. A beetle crawls along the edge, undisturbed. Everything about this rock says, I didn't need paperwork to matter. It reminds you of a letter once written by a Ming Dynasty scholar who had been denied a transport permit 3 times. Instead of growing bitter, he simply found a smaller rock from a nearby hill, brought it home in a sack, and wrote, It is not grand, but it listens, and that is more than most men. Mick drop. Because that's the heart of this whole thing, isn't it? Whether the stone is emperor approved or bootlegged, whether it's written about in fancy scrolls or forgotten in a patch of ivy, its worth doesn't come from who stamped a seal on it. It comes from what you bring to it, your stillness, your stories, your willingness to stop and stare at a rock long enough for the rest of the world to fall away. So let the bureaucracy have its moment. Let the forms pile up in some forgotten drawer of history, because here you are, with a stone in front of you, and nothing between you and its quiet, stubborn truth. No paperwork required. The wind settles, a single leaf spirals down and lands softly on the back of your hand. You let it stay there. You've stopped swatting things away in this garden. Even the ants seem philosophical now. Even the silence has layers. You rise from beside unregistered wisdom, brushing a bit of moss from your sleeve, and walk slowly along a sun-dappled path that curls like a lazy river. You're headed toward a part of the garden you haven't visited yet, a gentle slope rising toward a low stone wall where the shadows feel older somehow. And that's where it hits you. The walls, the stones inside. All of this has been curated, not just gathered, but chosen, placed, arranged. So it shouldn't be a surprise that, yes, even the world of scholars' rocks had its criminal underbelly. We're not talking mafia levels of scandal here. No rock smuggling rings with secret passwords and coded fan poems, although, now that you're imagining it, that sounds incredible. But there were, in fact, counterfeiters, tricksters, and full-blown frauds lurking in the corners of the stone world. It makes sense, doesn't it? By the late Ming and Qing periods, certain rocks were fetching high prices. Rare stones with that perfect mix of openness, thinness, perforation, and dramatic flair could sell for more than a scholar's annual salary. And where there's profit, there's forgery. You pause beside a long bench near a small reflecting pool. A particularly charismatic rock stands near the edge, tall, deeply grooved, its curves so perfect they almost seem planned.
You narrow your eyes. Could it be? You reach out and feel along the surface, a little too smooth in places. The perforations look almost staged. Not that you'd know for sure, but the possibility lingers, because yes, some rocks were fake aged. Craftsmen learned to mimic the effects of natural erosion, acid treatments, controlled chipping, even in one bizarre documented case, soaking a stone in pickle brine for 2 months to give it that aged riverbed finish. Somewhere, a scholar sniffed and called it emotionally artificial. Others used heat and smoke to replicate the texture of wind-blown crags. A few daring souls tried firecrackers, results mixed. And some just chiseled carefully and lied. Honestly, a decent chunk of rock provenance stories probably included more fiction than your average folk tale. Historians still argue whether this fraudulence was seen as betrayal or just another branch of artistic creativity. Some scholars were furious when they found out their beloved stone had been aged in a vinegar barrel. Others shrugged and said, "It still makes me cry at dusk, good enough." Because again, it wasn't just about origin, it was about effect. You sit now, pulling your legs up on the bench, watching that probably fake stone across the pool. It looks back at you with utter confidence. No shame, just presence. You smirk. All right, you think, I see you. But the forgeries didn't stop with aging techniques. No. Things got elaborate. Some rocks were passed off as imperial discards. A forged letter would accompany them, claiming they were once owned by a famous poet or displayed in a now-destroyed royal garden. A collector's fantasy. There were entire fake backstories, like literary Tinder profiles. "Hi, I'm Windsplit Wound, previously owned by Lord Zhao. I'm emotionally complex and shaped like a crying hawk. Let's make bad decisions together." Others were Frankenstein jobs, multiple rocks fused together to mimic naturally impossible forms. If done well, they fooled even the sharpest eyes. If done poorly, well, one critic described a particular fused rock as looking like two monks wrestling in shame. You glance down at a smaller stone near your feet. It's cracked in half, revealing what looks suspiciously like glue residue. You chuckle, not even ashamed of it. You reach out and name it Earnest Liar. A bird squawks somewhere above like it's laughing with you. And here's the thing, you're not mad, not really, because the more time you spend here, the more you understand. Authenticity isn't everything. The real power of these rocks isn't in their geological history. It's in their ability to stir something, an emotion, a memory, a moment of stillness you didn't expect. Sure, some people tried to cheat the system, but maybe that says more about the system than the cheaters. When people start faking nature to feel something real, doesn't that mean the desire is the realest part of all? You remember a story from an obscure scroll, a collector who bought a rock thinking it was from the sacred caves of Songshan. He wrote poems about it, meditated beside it for years. It inspired his best work. Then on his deathbed, someone finally told him the truth. It came from a roadside quarry outside Hangzhou. His final words, "Then bless that quarry." You laugh out loud at that one, scaring a squirrel. The stone doesn't move. You rise, stretch, walk a little farther into the garden. This part feels more honest somehow. Not because the rocks are realer, but because you've dropped your suspicion. You're not judging anymore. You're just meeting them, one by one, authentic or fake, ancient or newly carved, pedigreed or anonymous. They all have something to say, or rather, they don't, but you do, and they hold the space for it. You sit down beside a small, shapeless lump tucked beneath a fern. No holes, no ridges, no flare. Probably a beginner's mistake, maybe a forgery of a forgery. You touch it gently, almost nothing. You close your eyes and breathe. It doesn't matter how it got here, it's here, and so are you. A soft breeze coils around your ankles like a lazy cat. The air is thick with pine, wet stone, and something else, something quiet and a little sad, like an old book forgotten under the bed. You're still seated beside almost nothing, that humble, lumpish stone that asked for no attention and somehow earned all of it. And you begin to understand something deeper now. For all the emperor-fueled rock extravagance and poetic flourishes, the real soul of this tradition was always solitude, stillness, companionship without conversation, a kind of friendship that never needed words, because at the heart of the scholar's rock obsession was the scholar himself, or herself, sitting quietly in a tiny room, staring out a window, trying to make sense of the ache behind their ribs. You're not alone in this garden, not really. You're in the company of centuries of people who sat with rocks because they didn't know where else to put their feelings. You rise and begin to wander through a shaded colonnade, wooden beams weathered by rain and time, each casting long shadows across the stone path. In the alcoves to the side are small benches, and on those benches, more stones, not showy ones, modest, private. Some are wrapped in cloth, others paired with a teacup or a brush left mid-use. It feels like you've stumbled into a room where people just stepped out, minds still here, bodies gone. You take a seat at one of the benches. Before you is a stone the size of a sleeping cat. Flat, wrinkled. It looks like it's listening. And without really deciding to, you start talking, just a little. Maybe it's the solitude, maybe it's the fatigue. But you find yourself telling the stone something true. Not dramatic. Just
honest, a moment from years ago that still lingers in your chest, a memory no one asks about anymore. The stone doesn't blink, doesn't nod, doesn't fix anything. It just holds it, And that, you realize, is the exact thing you needed. There's a long history of this kind of behavior. Scholars were known to keep their rocks on desks, in windowsills, even beside their beds. Some wrote letters to them. Others claimed the rocks understood better than friends did. One particularly lonely magistrate in the late Ming dynasty confessed in his diary, "Today I told the stone about my failure at court. It did not laugh. I think I will forgive myself now." You smile. You get it. The scholar's rock for many was not just an aesthetic choice. It was a quiet companion, a therapist with no tongue, a mirror that didn't distort.
You could place your shame on it like a coat, and it would hold it gently, silently, forever. And it wasn't only the men. Though history tends to preserve the names and writings of male scholars, there were countless women, particularly in literate upper-class households, who formed their own intimate relationships with these stones. They tended garden corners, arranged tray landscapes, and whispered names into the crevices of rocks no one else would ever see. Imagine a woman in her 30s, confined mostly to the inner quarters, watching her children play in the courtyard. She can't travel, can't hold office. Her writing is praised in secret. But in her corner, a stone. And every morning she sits beside it, tells it how she's feeling, and in return it tells her nothing, which is sometimes all we really want. There's a story about a widow who kept a single wrinkled rock on her desk for 18 years. When asked why, she said, "Because it never tried to make me feel better." That hits, doesn't it? Because comfort isn't always encouragement. Sometimes it's just company. You look at the stone in front of you again. You haven't named it yet. It doesn't seem to mind. You whisper, "The one who waited," and feel something loosen in your chest. Historians still argue whether these emotional attachments were a coping mechanism or a form of self-reflection wrapped in aesthetics. But the rocks don't care what the scholars think. They just listen. And now you understand why so many scholars brought their stones with them into exile. Not their books, not their inkstones, their rocks. When sentenced to live on the fringes of the empire, far from the politics and poetry of court, they'd take one piece of stone, tuck it in a bundle, and carry it across mountains, because that rock had seen them, heard their confessions, witnessed the best and worst days of their carefully ordered lives. You walk further, passing another rock set gently against a wall. It's half hidden in ivy, sun-dappled old. You touch it lightly, not to test its surface, but to say hello. You imagine someone else long ago doing the same. A moment of human softness met by mineral silence. The most honest relationship some people ever had. You sit again, not tired, just full. And for a while you don't think, you don't speak. You just let the air settle. You're not trying to experience anything. You're not looking for wisdom. You're just sitting with a rock. And the rock, as always, sits with you. You wake from what might have been a nap or a blink or a 20-minute philosophical blackout. It's hard to tell anymore. Time moves differently here. The rocks don't measure it in minutes or hours. They keep their own clock. One that ticks maybe once a century. You roll your shoulders, crack your neck, and stretch your legs until your knees audibly protest. The stone beside you, the one who waited, says nothing about it. Of course it doesn't. You rise slowly, brushing a pine needle from your lap, and begin to wander again. The sun is lower now, angling through the trees, casting golden shapes across the courtyard. You pass more stones, some proud, some slumped, some chipped, some so strange they could be sea monsters paused mid-yawn. And then, suddenly, your path opens onto a strange little patio. Not stone, but wood, a single woven mat in the centre. No plaque, no tray landscape. Just a smooth, round stone sitting in the middle like a monk who gave up on robes. You know what this is? It's a Taoist stone-gazing station. No fanfare, no rankings, no curated elegance. Just you, the rock, and a serious chance of getting lost in your own head for hours. This is the Tao of rock contemplation, a quieter, slipperier tradition that wove its way through gardens like mist. It wasn't about aesthetics or reputation or even philosophy in the formal sense. It was about something more elusive, presence. You sit. The stone before you isn't remarkable. It's not hollow, not tall, doesn't look like a dragon or a tortured soul. It's round, dull, almost insultingly basic. But that's the point. You stare at it, not hard, not with effort, just stare. Breathe in, breathe out, let the edges soften. Time begins to slide, and slowly something shifts. The stone no longer feels like an object. It starts to feel like a place, a kind of mental landscape, a terrain not of cliffs and peaks, but of pause, of possibility. You're not thinking about the stone, you're with the stone, coexisting in this strange bubble of mutual irrelevance. You don't need it to be beautiful. It doesn't need you to admire it. You've both dropped the act, and that's the Taoist part. It's not about form. It's about non-resistance. You remember reading a line once, maybe Laozi, maybe someone quoting Laozi while drunk on plum wine. The rock does not strive, and yet it endures. The man who strives is already a little broken. It sounded poetic at the time, but now, sitting here, it lands a little harder. Because striving, that's all you ever do, to be better, smarter, kinder, stronger, more efficient, more creative, more present, and beneath it all, more worthy. But the rock doesn't do any of that. It doesn't even care if it gets named. It just is. And for one breath, you let yourself be that too, just a shape in the garden, just a presence among other presences. No productivity, no improvement, no hidden lesson, just stillness. Historians still argue whether these Taoist practices were formalized or just a natural outcome of too much tea and too little social stimulation. But they agree on one thing: this wasn't a performance. This was private transformation. The goal, if there even was one, was to disappear. Not literally, but ego-wise, to forget the story you're always telling yourself, to fade into the background hum of the garden and just breathe. You don't know how long you sit like that. 10 minutes? An hour? A small lifetime? Eventually, a breeze lifts the corner of the woven mat and you blink. The stone hasn't moved, but you feel a little
lighter, like you dropped something invisible. You bow slightly, not because it's tradition, but because the moment asked for it. And then you rise, walk, not toward anything, not away from anything, just with everything. You pass another rock along the edge of a path, and it looks briefly like the one you just left. You pause, ready to engage, but then you stop yourself. Not this time. You don't need a new moment. You're still carrying the last one, but quietly, you do give the new rock a name in your mind. Where I almost disappeared. You smile. The rock doesn't react, which of course is the best response of all. You wander now with no real direction, which is exactly the right way to wander. The paths here don't lead you so much as suggest. A curve of stone invites your feet one way, a whispering bamboo grove nudges you another. No signs, no markers, just intuition, and maybe the faint pull of curiosity dragging you gently from moment to moment. Eventually you reach a pond, still, wide, dappled with late afternoon light that glints off the water like lazy fireflies, the kind of place where conversations go to retire. The surface is so calm it feels like the sky forgot how to ripple. And at the pond's edge, a single stone. Half submerged, rounded with age, its reflection almost more real than the rock itself. You sit on a low wooden platform, cross-legged, elbows on knees, and watch it. This is the reflective stone, a literal and figurative icon of scholars' solitude, not just because it mirrored the sky, but because it mirrored you. And reflection for the scholar wasn't metaphorical fluff, it was work. The scholar's life was built on self-examination, moral cultivation, a constant tuning of the inner compass. And these rocks, especially ones near water, became a kind of meditation partner in that endless process. You're supposed to look into the pond, see the stone, and see yourself seeing the stone. Yeah, it's a little trippy, but also kind of perfect, because in that moment, stone, pond, you, all three are wrapped in a quiet loop of awareness. No one's the main character, no one's narrating, you're just in it. You lean forward slightly and see your own reflection beside the rocks. Two blurred figures, equally uncertain. And for a second,
The thought flutters through your mind. Which of us is more still? It's not a competition, obviously. The rock would win, but maybe stillness isn't about winning. Maybe it's about disappearing into presence. You sit a while longer. The sun slides a little lower. Somewhere a frog coughs. A fish disturbs the mirror surface. And for just a second, poof, your reflection vanishes. You laugh quietly. It feels like a small cosmic prank. The rock, of course, is unfazed, still watching, still being. You imagine a scholar from 900 years ago doing exactly this, knees sore from kneeling, robes damp with humidity, staring into a pond and asking questions with no answers. Who am I when I'm not striving? What part of me stays when everything else moves? What do I owe silence? And sometimes the rock answered, not with words, but with consistency, with refusal, with the same shape, the same surface, the same silence in it reminded them, you're not your status, you're not your title, you're not even your clever poem. You are the moment you give away without needing it back. Historians still argue whether these rock-water pairings were intentional spiritual tools or happy accidents of garden design. Some believe they were arranged to mimic immortal islands from Taoist lore, mystical realms just out of reach, always mirrored, never grasped. Others say the scholars just liked a good view. Either way, the effect was the same. A mirror that didn't flatter, didn't distort, just offered itself. And now here you are, 800 years later, doing the same. You look down again. Your reflection is back. A little older than you remembered. A little softer around the eyes. A little more okay with things being unresolved. You glance at the stone beside your reflection. You whisper, not expecting a reply. Thanks for not needing me to be interesting. Ing. And the pond replies with another ripple. You sit in that moment until your legs go a little numb, until the shadows start reaching, until the light becomes honeyed and the air tastes like goodbye. Then you rise, and before you leave, you pick up the smallest pebble near the water's edge, not as a souvenir, as a reminder. A little piece of stillness to carry in your pocket, not to show off, just to touch when you forget how to breathe. You walk away from the pond, not in a hurry, not toward anything specific, just walking. You don't look back at the stone because it'll be there. It always is. The light has thickened into gold now, pooling in the spaces between trees, painting warm halos on the edges of every rock you pass. You're no longer wandering. You're drifting, floating almost. The garden has you now, like a dream that doesn't want to end. And the stones, they're starting to feel less like objects and more like characters, old ones, familiar ones, the kind that don't speak unless you really need to hear something. You follow a narrow path that curls like smoke around a cluster of bamboo. The stalks whisper as you pass, no doubt discussing your poor posture. And then, as the path opens up, you see it. A giant stone, round, blunt, wide as a small car, covered in tiny carved characters so faint they look like shadows. You've arrived at one of the strangest and quietest rituals in the scholar's rock tradition, inscription. Because for some people it wasn't enough to just look at a stone or name it, or sit beside it for 27 years hoping it would finally blink. No, some scholars wanted to write on them, literally, carve words into the stone's skin, poems, reflections, meditations, even just a single character, carefully chosen, painstakingly etched. You step closer and squint. The surface is crowded with old Chinese script, curling like vines, each phrase clearly written by a different hand. Some confident, some tentative, some practically vanishing with time. It's a conversation, not between people, but between people and permanence. And right here, surrounded by these soft bark trees and crickets tuning up for their nightly orchestra, you can feel the question that pulses beneath every stroke. Will I be remembered? Not famous, not celebrated, just known. Known by someone, known by something, even if that something is just a lump of rock who'll never reply. You reach out and touch one of the carved phrases. The characters are so faded they're almost smooth again. Whatever this scholar once feared, once loved enough to immortalize, it's dissolving now, returning to silence. And somehow that makes it more beautiful. Because here's the secret truth behind these inscriptions. They weren't about visibility, they were about witness. It wasn't look at my words, it was let me be seen by you, you the stone, you the garden, you whoever might come next. One letter, one name, one brushstroke carved into the eternal. It wasn't bragging. It was a whisper, a plea. I was here. Historians still argue whether rock inscriptions were meant for posterity or just private catharsis. Some were clearly public, dedications, philosophical quotes, poems about fleeting beauty and the inevitable rot of political systems. Others were cryptic. One rock was found with only a single character, we, regret. No one knows who carved it, no one knows why, but you feel it. You walk around the giant stone now, reading what you can, a haiku-style verse about an autumn breeze, a frustrated couplet about courtly betrayal. One signature written so large it looks like the scholar was trying to outshout a mountain. You shake your head. Classic Lin Jen, always overcompensating. You sit on a nearby bench and imagine your own inscription. What would you carve? What single sentence would you entrust to a being that doesn't age, you think? Then smile and say softly, don't wait for answers, just listen better. You don't carve it, not yet. Instead, you reach into your pocket and run your fingers over that small stone you picked up earlier, the one by the pond, still smooth, still silent. You wonder if anyone will ever inscribe that one, or if it will just pass from hand to hand, garden to garden, collecting fingerprints and quiet moments, until one day it's dropped back into the soil and forgotten. And if that happens, you think it would be okay? Not every story needs to be carved. Some can live quietly in the creases of a palm, or the pause between footsteps, or a dusty shelf where someone sits down, sighs, and decides not to read a book for once. You look up. The stone before you glows faintly in the last light of day. The characters on its back are blurry now, barely legible, but their presence is still there, still whispering, we were here, and so are you. The light is slipping, not fading, slipping, like silk being drawn slowly off a table. What was golden an hour ago is now lavender, blue, the colour of deep breath and bedtime thoughts. You're still in the garden, still walking, but your pace has softened. Like the rocks, you've settled into a kind of gravity. You find yourself now at a bend in the path where the trees lean closer, as if whispering secrets to the moss. It's darker here, quieter. And right in the centre of this hush sits a rock unlike any you've seen so far. Tall, slender, twisted like a ribbon caught mid-spin. And its surface? Burnt. Not entirely, but patches of it are charred, black, streaked with soot, pocked like old skin. This is no accident. This is a fire-treated stone, a rare artifact from one of the more extreme corners of the scholar's tradition. You sit slowly on a nearby flat rock and stare at it, because what you're looking at is a stone that was nearly destroyed on purpose, to make it more beautiful. No, yes. Welcome to one of the oddest, most intense aesthetic experiments in all of rock appreciation, creative damage. Sometimes a stone wasn't quite right. Maybe its form was close but not evocative. Maybe it lacked that sense of melancholy so prized by the literati. So what did they do? They altered it. They introduced it to fire. Controlled burning was one method. The heat would bring out unexpected cracks, colours, sometimes even hollow out weak areas, leaving behind something eerily delicate. Other times, stones were soaked in brine and then baked, encouraging slow corrosion. The results were unpredictable, risky, irreversible. But when it worked, you got something like this. This rock in front of you looks wounded, yes, but also awakened, like something that had to survive a storm to finally show you its truth. You walk closer, reach out. The charred areas are rougher than the rest, porous, fragile. You can feel the story in its surface. Whatever it was before, it's something else now, transformed. And here's the wildest part. These acts of controlled damage weren't hidden. They were celebrated. Collectors would write about the smoked sorrow of a particular piece or praise the ash-born curve of a newly cracked ridge. One scholar called his favourite stone the phoenix's rib because it had been through fire and come out better. Historians still argue whether this was a form of ritualized expression or just the result of too much idle time and access to matches. But they all agree it wasn't vandalism, it was curation through destruction. And that idea, however strange, has stuck with you. You sit again, staring at the scorched stone. You wonder, how many of us are beautiful because we've been burned? How many of our best qualities were carved by disappointment, hollowed by grief, reshaped by failure? This rock didn't lose its worth when it cracked. It found it, not in spite of the damage, because of it. You think of that moment you still don't talk about, the one that rewrote you, the one that scorched a little part of your life and left a scar you keep covering with jokes, or busyness, or long walks with no destination. And now, in the dim hush of this garden, you begin to see it differently, not as a loss, but as a contour, a curve you didn't have before. The fire gave this stone a story. So did yours. You whisper a name for it, brake light. And you don't ask it to explain itself. You just sit beside it, companionable in silence, because maybe that's the final evolution of this whole strange tradition. Not admiration, not possession, not even transformation, just recognition. A scholar might spend their whole life collecting rocks, arranging them, studying them, and only at the end realize the point was never to find the perfect shape. The point was to witness yourself through imperfection, to name your cracks without flinching, to keep going, even scorched. You reach into your pocket, pull out the small pebble again, the one from the pond, still smooth, still whole. You run your thumb over it, and then very gently you press it to one of the charred patches on Brakelight's surface. For 1 second, old and new meet. Whole and cracked, past and future. Neither one flinches. You let the moment settle, and then you walk on, into the blue of coming night. The sky has shifted now into that strange silvery blue that only shows up between sunset and darkness, when the world is exhaling and everything feels like it's waiting for something. The crickets have started their nightly overture. The breeze is cooler. You're no longer wandering. You're gliding, like the garden has scooped you up and is carrying you along. And then you hear it, a faint clinking sound. Not mechanical, not wind. More like porcelain tapping. You follow it, curious, your footsteps muffled by moss and time. At the end of a narrow path, behind a curtain of weeping branches, you find a clearing. And in the middle, a low table, 2 cups, 1 teapot, and a stone. This is not a display.
This is a tea setting. And the rock. It's placed precisely where a third guest would sit. You take a breath. You've stumbled into another layer of this strange, obsessive world, the ritual of tea and stone. Because yes, there was a time not that long ago when certain scholars poured tea with rocks, not on them, with them. They treated the rock like a companion, a quiet guest, someone who wouldn't drink but would witness, a presence to help hold the silence. You kneel by the table. It's dusty now, the cups are empty, the teapot is cracked. But the stone? Still there, dark green, wide, rippled like an old brain. It doesn't look like much, but in this moment, with this arrangement, it feels like a third person in the room, someone who's heard every story, held every pause, never interrupted. You sit across from it, pour imaginary tea, and exhale. Because this isn't about hydration or even ceremony. It's about hospitality toward stillness, toward presence, toward the part of yourself that needs to be quiet and not perform for a little while. Historians still argue whether the tea rock tradition was literal or poetic metaphor. Some say the scholars never actually placed rocks at the table, just wrote poems imagining it. Others claim old inventories list guest stones that were brought out only for tea ceremonies. Either way, the symbolism was clear. The rock was the perfect guest. It didn't talk too much, didn't judge your tea temperature, didn't argue about politics, didn't eat the last sesame cake and pretend not to notice. It just showed up, fully, completely, without ego. You pour yourself a little phantom cup, hold it, sip nothing. The stone remains motionless, magnificently unimpressed, and yet you feel seen. There's something deeply comforting about pretending the rock is listening. Maybe because it actually is, just not in a way you're used to. It's listening the way old trees listen, the way stars might listen, not with ears, with presence. You look at the stone again, wonder what stories it's heard from past tea drinkers, whispers of heartbreak, jokes that made someone spill tea through their nose, rants about local politics, silent mourning. You imagine a scholar pouring tea here 300 years ago, fresh from some bureaucratic disaster, finding solace in this tiny ritual. 2 cups for people, 1 for the stone. You nod at the rock. Thanks for making room for me. You give it a name, guest of honor, and for a moment you let yourself believe it bows back. You don't rush to leave. You sit through the imaginary tea. You pour a second cup. Let your mind float a little. Think about your own table back home, your own rhythms, who or what you make room for. What kind of presence you are when someone sits across from you, needing silence more than advice. You reach across the table, touch the rock lightly, its surface is warm from the day. You close your eyes and imagine the warmth traveling up your fingers, through your arm, into your chest. Settling there, quiet heat, lasting stillness. A kind of ancient hospitality. You rise eventually. Dust off your knees and without looking back, walk into the night, carrying with you a feeling you can't quite name. But it feels like being welcomed by something that never needed words to love you. The garden has grown dim now, not dark, not yet, but muted. Everything is quieter, softer. The greens are deeper, the shadows stretchier. And the rocks, they've stopped posing. They're just there now, like furniture in the living room of the universe. You move more slowly, as if walking through water, or a memory. The crickets are louder than your footsteps. The lanterns along the path are starting to glow, a warm amber hush that doesn't so much light the way as gently suggest it. You pass a grove of pines, then a cluster of azaleas, and then, tucked just behind a low stone wall in a dip in the land, you see something that stops you cold. A grave, but not a human one, a stone's, set into a small square of earth with a tiny, weathered plaque and a single offering bowl beside it. This is clearly not just a misplaced rock. This was buried, carefully, intentionally. You step closer and read the inscription, "To Spring's End, faithful friend, gone soft." You blink, then smile, because yes, it's true. Sometimes when a scholar's stone finally crumbled, cracked beyond recognition, or simply eroded into nothing special, they didn't discard it. They buried it. They mourned it like a companion. They dug a small patch of earth in their garden and laid it to rest with poems, with incense, with whispered thanks. And here lies one such stone, gone soft according to the plaque. Maybe the rain got to it, maybe the moss grew too deep, maybe it simply stopped holding meaning the way it once did, but instead of being tossed aside, it was laid down. And something about that hits you hard, because we're not used to this kind of goodbye. We toss broken things, we delete, discard, donate, detach. But this is farewell with reverence, a ritual for the unremarkable. You kneel beside the grave, the dirt is packed, the bowl is empty, but you feel tempted to leave something anyway. You search your pockets, then remember the small, smooth pebble from the pond. You hesitate. But no, not that one. You need it still. Instead, you find a dried seed pod from your walk, cupped in your hand like a tiny boat. You place it in the offering bowl and say quietly, "May your silence last." Then sit beside the grave for a while, not thinking, not narrating, just breathing. Because this moment isn't about you. It's about what happens when the beautiful things we love stop being beautiful. What do we do then? Do we get angry?
Embarrassed? Do we pretend we never cared? Or do we make space for the end? Historians still argue whether stone burials were symbolic or sincere. Some believe the graves were a joke, a kind of tongue-in-cheek gesture among eccentric collectors. Others insist they were heartfelt, that for some scholars these rocks were closer than most people, and when they died, they deserved a ceremony. You rise slowly, knees creaking, brush your palms on your thighs. You don't feel morbid, you feel grateful. Grateful for a tradition that made room for endings, for decay, for the moment when even the object of your deepest stillness can no longer hold its shape. And that's okay, because meaning doesn't live in permanence. It lives in attention. And the moment you stop paying attention, that's when it ends, not when the rock crumbles, when you forget what it meant to you. You take one last look at the little grave. There's a light breeze. The seed pod shifts in the bowl like it's nodding. You nod back and keep walking toward the deepening dark, toward the next story. Night has arrived gently, like a friend who lets themselves in without knocking, turns on a low lamp and sits beside you without saying a word. The garden is a world of silhouettes now. The stones no longer demand to be seen, they simply exist. Dark shapes in darker spaces, presences, not objects. And yet, you keep going. Your feet follow instinct more than intention. You're not trying to reach anything, you just don't want to leave. Not yet. Not when the air feels like velvet and the quiet is so thick you could fold it into a pillow. Eventually you come upon something unexpected. A table, half hidden under the eaves of an old pavilion. Low, polished, empty, except for the stone. It sits in the centre, alone, upright, almost too perfectly placed. And next to it, a brush, an inkstone, and a piece of rice paper, blank as fresh snow. You stand there for a while, because what you've found isn't just a table, it's a writing station. And not just for poems. This was where scholars came to argue with the rocks. Yes, you heard that right. There was a time, especially during the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, when certain literati treated their rocks not as inspiration, but as adversaries, sparring partners, philosophical foils. They'd come here, stare at the rock, and write counterpoints. If the rock suggested permanence, they'd write about change. If it felt twisted, they'd compose verses about simplicity. If it whispered silence, they'd respond with shouting ink. The idea wasn't to defeat the stone, it was to engage it, to treat it as an equal, a teacher, a challenge. And that was the beauty of this place. It turned reflection into dialogue. You sit, lift the brush. Don't dip it yet, just hold it. Feel the weight, the softness of the bristles, the tremble of possibility. You look at the stone, it's medium-sized, a little pitted. One sharp ridge down the centre. You imagine it saying something snide about your haircut. You smirk, then lean forward and in your mind ask, what am I still avoiding? Silence. Of course. You dip the brush in phantom ink, glide it over phantom paper. The words arrive like birds you didn't call for. Stillness isn't always peace. Sometimes it's fear with better manners. You blink. That wasn't what you expected. But maybe that's the point, because this wasn't about flattery. The stone wasn't here to soothe you. It was here to press you, to reveal things you didn't want to look at, to sharpen your thoughts by giving you something to push against. It's easy to romanticize rocks, to sit beside them and feel wise and timeless and patient. It's harder to let them provoke you, to let their silence make you uncomfortable, to ask, what am I using stillness to hide from? Historians still argue whether this debate with stone tradition was widespread or just the pet practice of a few intellectual rebels. But there's evidence. Fragments of essays, ink-stained scrolls, letters between friends, suggesting that for some scholars the rock wasn't a companion or a relic. It was a mirror that talks back, not with sound, but with presence that refuses to agree with your ego. You write again. This time, a single line. I am not the silence I pretend to be. You exhale, set down the brush, and sit back. The rock doesn't move and doesn't congratulate you, doesn't nod sagely like a fortune cookie, but something inside you shifts just a little, like a door left cracked, like a breeze sneaking in. You sit there in the dark for a while longer, not because you're still writing, but because the stone is still speaking, even in silence. Especially in silence, you leave the paper blank, because the best conversations don't always leave evidence. Sometimes they just leave you walking away slower, heavier, and a little more honest than before. You walk differently now, not slower necessarily, but with more weight. Like your feet have finally realized they belong to gravity. Like each step tugs at something deeper than just your legs. The garden has shifted again, not physically, atmospherically. It feels older, like it's remembering things. And maybe you are too. You follow a gently sloping path that seems to fold in on itself, a loop that offers no destination, only experience. You can't quite tell if you're going in circles, but you're not lost, not really. And then you hear it. Music, not loud, not even melodic, just a faint ting, ting, like a bell struck by wind. You follow it, letting the sound lead you through a hedge of night-blooming jasmine and down into a grove. There, nestled beneath a wooden awning, is an odd little platform, elevated with 3 rocks on it. Each rock is wired, yes, wired, to what looks like a series of hollow bamboo tubes, old bronze bells and tiny drums. It's not a band, it's a contraption. You've arrived at one of the rarest, weirdest corners of the tradition, the sounding stones. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Some scholars, particularly in the Qing dynasty, got very, very into acoustic geology. They would tap stones, strike them, rub them, drape them with strings and pluck them, not to play them in the musical sense, but to explore what they sounded like. To them it was more than curiosity, it was revelation, because every stone, they believed, had a voice. A tone that revealed something about its internal structure, its age, its spiritual resonance. Some were deep and resonant like the thrum of a distant drum. Others were brittle, high-pitched, barely audible. They called them resonant souls, and they built entire devices like the one before you to coax that sound out. You step closer. One of the rocks is smooth, dark, almost metallic-looking. The second is jagged, sun-bleached, full of sharp edges. The third, round, hollow in parts, covered in faint notches. You take the small stick left on the bench nearby and gently tap the first rock. A low, humming tone. More felt than heard. You close your eyes, tap the second, higher, crisper, like a porcelain plate struck with a spoon. Then the third. It rings. Clear. Short. Then gone, like a bird call lost in fog. You sit, and you begin to understand why some scholars spent entire afternoons doing this. Not for entertainment, for alignment. Because, strange as it sounds, listening to rocks tunes you, not your ears, your attention. It draws you out of your mind and into the moment, forces you to notice the tiniest things, texture, vibration, the way sound dissolves into stillness. You strike the third rock again, ding. It feels like something inside you answering back. And that's when you remember. Some believed that sound was the rock's way of speaking truth. A confession, perhaps, a declaration, a signal that it was ready to be understood. Historians still argue whether any of this had actual scientific merit or was just the geological version of playing with your food. But records exist, poems about the weeping tones of sorrowed limestone, garden plans that included sounding stages, even debates in letters between scholars about which types of stones were tonally sincere. You tap once more, then again, and suddenly you're not in a garden, you're in a concert of the earth's memories. The air around you vibrates in sympathy. The night holds its breath. The rock doesn't change. But you do, because you're listening now in a way you weren't before. Not just to sound, to everything. The way your thoughts rise and fall like waves, the rhythm of your own breathing, the small ache in your shoulder you've been ignoring, the echo of an emotion you couldn't name this morning, but recognize now as loneliness, or maybe contentment, hard to say. You touch the smoothest stone and name it, echo's first home. Then the sharp one, friction, finally honest. And the round one? You don't name that one yet. You think it's still deciding what sound it wants to be, and maybe that's fair. Not everything needs to be labelled right away. Some things are still resonating. You stand, set the stick down gently, and walk away. But the sounds come with you, not ringing in your ears, but resting in your bones. By now the garden is almost entirely dark, save for a few lanterns and the pale wash of moonlight making everything look like a memory. The shadows are long, the air cool, and the world feels like it's tucking itself in for the night. And yet, somehow the stones don't seem to sleep. They keep vigil, watching, waiting. You follow a narrow stepping stone path now, each stone flat and slick beneath your feet. The trees lean overhead like an arched cathedral of leaves. And just when you think you might finally be reaching the edge of this quiet maze, you see a structure through the trees. Small, elegant, bare. A scholar's hut. Not a full house, not even a pavilion. Just a tiny wooden room with 3 walls and 1 open side, facing a simple table and a stone. Of course. You step inside. It smells of ink, wood, and distant sandalwood smoke. There's a bench, a candle stub, a long dried brush, and on the table, resting like a sleeping dog, is a stone worn smooth by generations of glances. This is where the real work happened, because while we've seen stones in gardens, in ponds, on platforms and beside teacups, this was the nerve centre, the private studio, the writing room, the thought-forging forge. And always, always there was a rock, not for display, but for focus. See, scholars didn't just collect stones to admire them, they used them to anchor their minds, to sharpen their thinking, to hold presence in place while thoughts scattered and ink dried and distractions clawed at the door. This one, on the table now, is unremarkable. Palm-sized, flat, no curves, just a quiet presence, the kind of shape that doesn't demand but receives. You sit, rest your hands on the table, stare, and wait. At first, nothing. Then a thought floats up, slow and unannounced. This is the first time today I've heard nothing. And that nothing? It's beautiful. Because in this hut, with this stone, nothing isn't empty. It's available. It's a room with the furniture cleared out. And in that space, your mind begins to wander. Not chaotically, but curiously, like a child exploring a house with all the doors unlocked. You think of a problem you haven't solved. You think of a fear you haven't named. You think of someone you miss. And somehow, the stone holds space for all of it. You're not thinking about the rock. You're thinking through it. That's what these stones were, after all. Mental tuning forks. Objects that returned you to now. That stilled the tremble. That said, without saying, you don't need to be anywhere else. Historians still argue whether the scholar's hut stone was ceremonial or functional. But enough personal diaries remain, enough ink-stained ramblings and late-night entries, that it's clear the stone was more than decor. It was necessary, like a grounding wire for the soul. You glance down again. The stone doesn't glow, doesn't shimmer, doesn't whisper ancient truths. It just sits there, being unchanging, steady. And in that steadiness you feel your own edges soften, your breath deepen, your pulse slow, not asleep, just present, completely. You imagine what it must have been like, long nights, candle flickering, brush scraping paper, tea cooling beside a half-written verse, and this stone always there, listening, witnessing, refusing to rush. You reach out and touch it. It's cool, dry, almost indifferent. You give it a name, quietly. Anchor in the static. You think it approves. You stay a little longer. Not to think, not to write, just to be. Eventually you stand, bow gently, leave the hut exactly as you found it. But you carry something out with you, a little more stillness than you had before. And as you step back into the night, the garden greets you again, not with novelty, but with recognition, as if to say, good, you're back. The night is thick now, full and quiet and stitched together with the hush of rustling leaves. Your feet move without thought. The path ahead is no longer something you choose, but something you allow, like floating down a river that forgot how to rush. Somewhere in the trees a bird calls once, low and strange, not warning, just existing. And ahead, in the center of a small clearing, illuminated by the softest circle of lantern light, you see what might be the most puzzling rock yet. It's big, really big, but not jagged, not towering. It's flat, like someone sliced a mountain at the knees and left the top here as an offering. On its surface, ink, old ink, black smears, long brush strokes, pale as breath now, worn down by years of weather and wind and maybe a few too many squirrel stampedes. This is what's called a calligraphy stone, a sacred kind of desk, not for placing ching things on, but for using itself as the canvas. Yes, you're seeing what you think you're seeing. People wrote directly on this stone, brush dipped in water or ink, stroke by stroke, sometimes poetry, sometimes philosophy, sometimes just characters practiced again and again, Tao, Jing, Wu, like mantras in mineral form. And because it's stone, the ink didn't last, not for long. Some strokes evaporated in minutes, others darkened and clung for days. A few, carved deliberately, lasted centuries, but most gone, vanished into the grain. This was impermanence made physical. You sit on a low bench beside it. The stone hums with old effort, like it's still echoing every character ever traced across its back. You reach out and run your fingers over a dry, ghostly mark. The brush was heavy there. The writer pressed with emotion. Maybe frustration, maybe purpose, or maybe they were just showing off. You smile, because this wasn't about showing anything. It was about doing, the act of writing, the ceremony of it, the feeling of a brush meeting resistance, the moment of intention made real, even if just for seconds. You whisper a character aloud, Jing, stillness. It suits the stone. You can almost imagine the scholar who sat here 600 years ago, breathing slow, brush in hand, moon above, mosquitoes circling like bad metaphors and pouring their thoughts into a surface that would forget them within the hour. And maybe that was the point. Not permanence, but release. Historians still argue whether these stones were meditative tools or spontaneous whims, whether the act of writing on them was sacred or just a passing hobby. But one record describes an old monk who wrote a new haiku on his stone every morning, then waited as the dew erased it. By evening, he called it his daily disappearance. You love that, you rise. There's a bucket nearby, a brush. Someone's left it there, as if inviting you to continue the tradition. You don't hesitate. Dip the brush in water, lean over the stone, and write slowly, gently. Let this go. It's not profound, it's not polished, but it's true. The water glides over the stone like silk. The letters shimmer for a few seconds, then begin to fade. Already your words are softening, slipping back into the rock, into the world. And in that fading, you feel relief, because you've said what needed saying. And now it doesn't need to linger. You set the brush down, watch the last trace of your sentence vanish into the stone's broad, waiting back. You name it, the one who forgets with grace. You bow, and as you turn to leave, the clearing feels just a little lighter, like your sentence left space behind. Instead of taking any, you carry nothing, and somehow that feels like everything. The night feels endless now, not in a heavy way, not like something you're stuck inside, more like a long, soft hallway that no one ever rushes down. A hush so deep it feels like velvet on your skin. You move carefully like you're walking through someone else's dream. And maybe you are. The garden has grown impossibly quiet. The wind no longer rustles its sighs. The lanterns are fewer, the paths narrower, until finally you reach what looks like the edge of everything, a wall, but not a barrier, a cliff. You're at the far end of the garden now. It drops away here. And what lies beyond isn't another view of plants or ponds, but mountains. dark silhouettes stacked like frozen waves under a pale moon. And set at the cliff's edge, a rock, not elaborate, not grand, just a seat, worn perfectly to the shape of someone who sat here often. You sit and feel the weight of it. This was the thinking stone, or the forgetting stone, or maybe the just stop trying so hard stone. The place where scholars came not to reflect or analyze or admire, but to let go. Because even in a world where every rock was a metaphor, even in the age of inscriptions and tea ceremonies and poetic sparring, sometimes a rock just had to be a place to sit down and say nothing. You breathe in, out, again. Nothing moves except the moon. You don't need a name for this stone. You already know it, because this is the part of the garden they never talked about in scrolls or letters, the part without commentary, without philosophy, without a label. It was never about collecting every rock or naming them or understanding them. It was about reaching the edge of your own thoughts and not pushing past it. You close your eyes and listen, not for words, for the lack of them, that soft, ringing absence that only comes when the mind is done performing and the world no longer expects anything clever from you. And here's the strangest thing. It doesn't feel empty. It feels full, like silence is a container, and you're just now realizing how much it can hold. A memory flickers. A scholar, anonymous, once wrote in the corner of his notebook, "The rock at the edge does not teach, it waits, and in its waiting, I remember how to be." Historians have no idea who he was. No one ever found that particular rock. But you think, maybe it was this one. Or maybe every scholar had their own version. A place that wasn't about knowledge or beauty or symbolism, but about release, about unlearning, about dropping everything they thought they had to carry. You take one last breath and feel yourself settle, not into thought, but into place. You stand, not reluctantly, but quietly. And this time, when you look at the rock, you don't try to name it or categorize it or remember it in a special way. You just thank it silently. Then you walk away. No path ahead now, just the garden wrapping around you like a blanket, like a story that knows how to end itself. You are moving slowly now, not from fatigue, but from respect. The way you move when you're leaving something sacred. The way you walk backward out of a dream, careful not to disturb the part still blooming behind you. The garden is quiet, but not silent. It breathes, so do you. There are fewer rocks now, or maybe they're just less visible, swallowed into shadow. You don't need to see them anymore. You know they're there, watching. Not with eyes, but with form, with presence. And then through a bamboo archway and down a final winding path, you reach it. A gate, modest, wooden, half open. On one side of it, this side, everything you've just lived. And on the other, the ordinary world. Shoes, streetlights, notifications. But you don't step through yet. Instead, you turn, and there it is, your final stone. It's just off the path, almost shy, like it doesn't want to interrupt. Small, lopsided. The kind of rock that no one would put in a museum. Too simple, too cracked, too quiet. But here's the twist. It's the first rock placed in the garden. Centuries ago, before the pond, before the pines, before the calligraphy stones and the scholar's hut and all the rest, this was the anchor, the seed, the why. A nameless monk, so the story goes, carried it on his back from a mountain 2 days' walk away, set it here, sat beside it, said nothing, and just kept coming back day after day until others started joining him. No speeches, no manifestos, just a rock and the act of not leaving it alone. And that's how the garden began, with devotion. To nothing in particular. You kneel beside the stone, touch it lightly, and feel something simple settle in your chest, like recognition, not just of the rock, but of yourself. Because maybe that's what this whole journey has been. Not about understanding rocks, but about remembering stillness. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't fix, doesn't need to be productive, just is. And this stone never asked to be collected, or praised, or named. It simply stayed. and in doing so gave others permission to do the same. You don't name it, you don't need to. Instead, you bow one last time, then step through the gate. The night air is cooler now, sharper, the kind that reminds you you're alive. You smile, not big, just enough. And the garden remains behind you, but somehow it's also coming with you. Now the path is gone. Now the rocks are behind you. Now the garden drifts slowly out of reach, like mist unraveling across an early morning lake. And that's okay, because you're different now. You carry it with you, not in your hands, but in the quiet space behind your ribs, the part of you that watches without rushing, that listens without trying to reply, that recognizes beauty, not because it's grand, but because it's still. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles soften. Let your jaw unhinge just slightly. You don't need to hold anything up anymore. Feel the weight of your body where you lie. Feel the gravity that once shaped those ancient stones, now cradling you. Maybe there's a sound in the room with you, a fan, a hum, a distant car whispering past your window. Let it blur. Let it blend with the memories of moonlit pines and tea shared with silent guests. You are no longer walking. You are no longer thinking. You are becoming like the stones themselves, present, quiet, enough. And if tomorrow arrives carrying noise or tasks or tangled thoughts, just remember this place, this softness, this steadiness, this story that didn't need to be told, but waited patiently for someone like you to listen. Close your eyes now. There's nothing more to find. You're already home.